I will start by introducing myself. Because writing a first-person point-of-view story with some nameless person telling you a story is lame. Yes, that was aimed at you, Grandpa. My name is Sarah Endora Kane. Sarah, because it's a traditional Japanese name with no real significance worth mentioning. None. It just sounds like the Western name Sarah the way my parents pronounced it. I got the name Endora in honor of my paternal great-grandmother. Which baffled her, since my dad, her grandson, loathed her. It may have been a way to ensure that old Endora didn't feel like she had to step in to protect me from the evils of even the men I was related to. Great-grandmother has some major issues. My last name Kane also comes from old Endora. It was the name she chose after fleeing her family to come to colonial America. My younger sister got the full story. Normally Ami would love to blab, but this time she looked hesitant and told me to ask great-grandmother myself if I wanted to know about it. You know what? I think I can live without that information. I am half Japanese on my mother's side from the Ichiban family. And I strongly favor that side of my family, except for my weird eyes. Green and yellow mixed in with each other with an almost black ring around the outside. I used to be self-conscious about it until my grandpa on my dad's side said that my other great-grandmother, his mom, had the same eyes. I'm the only one of her descendants with them. So, that's kind of cool. It's a connection with an entire side of my family I had only recently found out about. See, my little sister got witch powers from my dad's side of the family. And both sides started fighting over who got to steal her away from mom and dad for their own purposes. So, after Aunt Rosaria burned down our house by accident, we've all agreed to pretend to believe Grandma Brianna gave me an old necklace she had. One of those half-heart-shaped ones, with the initials JL on hers. The necklace would swing around when I held it by the chain, but then it would just hang out there at an angle to guide me, Ami, and our little brother Aaron all the way to my dad's father, John Lathe. A man who I had never met, and who didn't know that his son, let alone us, existed. This happened just a few months after he won a lottery, which made the appearance of a previously unknown bunch of relatives sort of suspicious. He also just a week before we showed up had gotten bitten by a werewolf, which did at least make him somewhat accepting of weird things like previously unknown relatives showing up. I don't blame him for being suspicious, but when he saw my eyes, well, it was like a switch had been flipped from doubtful old man to, well, grandpa. A bad joking, hair-musing, junk food pushing, old man who bottles up all his emotions until he breaks down inside sort of grandpa. Also an indulgent, forgiving, supportive old man sort of grandpa who even when he thought he was going to lose everything, he was still looking out for us first. He's very frustrating. Right now, we're living in his house, his very large house. The place had almost been fully built by some guy who ran out of money. Then years later, Grandpa bought it, got it finished, and moved in. He calls it Stately Wayne Manor since his middle name is Wayne, and it's a quote from the original Batman TV series he made us watch a few episodes of. But I tracked down the original floor plans in his safe room, and it was originally meant to be called Olympia, which explains the Greek-themed decorations here and there. I watched the rest of the Batman series on my own with my little brother, despite all my complaints when Grandpa had made us watch it. It's sort of a so bad it was good type of thing. But, we will have a new house in a few more weeks. The work crews, all locals, just had to finish the interiors. Grandpa sold my dad some land on the south end of his property for $1. The new house will be large enough that me and my sister won't have to share a room again. Which will be a relief for both of us. Or at least that's what I would have thought. Right now, I have what the floor plans call a retiring room up in the attic level at the top of the stairs. It was apparently a room meant for people to sit and catch their breath between dancing in the ballroom, which takes up most of the rest of the attic. It has a balcony, and there's even a half bath at the end of a hall that runs alongside it. But I have to go downstairs to take a shower. The same hallway also has the only closet, since there isn't one in the room. But even with a room of her own, my sister keeps showing up in mine to talk before we go to bed, and half the time she ends up sleeping in the bed next to me anyways, or curls up on the old blue couch. I guess she just wants some familiarity after all the changes in our life. Which doesn't explain why Aaron also ends up there with us until mom or dad carries him down to his own room. I mean, the only time he shared a room with us was when we first got here, and Grandpa thought I wouldn't relax enough to sleep unless I was able to see both of my siblings. So that's the background. Me, my sibs, and my parents living at Grandpa's mansion while our own house was being built. Ami stayed with us even while getting trained by both sides of the family. And me about to turn 14 at a party with all my grandpa's brothers and his one sister as guests. Along with all of their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. Only 2 of which I've ever met. All coming to meet me and my immediate family. With all but 2 of them ignorant of magic. So it's all of them, along with several of my relatives on the other side of my family, and the witches, my aunt, and my grandmother. Thankfully, great-grandmother Indora won't be there. I mean, she was invited out of politeness since we didn't want a Maleficent situation, but she declined. But it's not like she is going to change her mind and show up anyways, right? Before we get into anything else, I should talk about the big party back in June. Starting with even more exposition. My parents had only had the land for our new home surveyed and were still deciding on floor plans and a look. With Grandpa egging them both on to add more and more rooms, despite both of them liking to keep things simple. He did talk them into a studio space for sparring off of the home gym, with a little extension nook for a piano since my dad had taken lessons when he was a kid. And a little conservatory for herbs off of the kitchen my mom had always wanted since Grandpa claimed Ami would need someplace to grow some plants she would need for her magic. Making it about Ami gave my mom the excuse to indulge herself. At about this time every summer our local sheriff hosted a party for the local werewolves. On the day of the summer solstice, so if the party fell on a full moon, they had the longest day to enjoy themselves before any of them had to turn into wolves. It was also why it was usually held in an isolated spot. Grandpa volunteered to host it this year since a bunch of the werewolves had shown up to help when a vampire came after him with a small army of mind-controlled victims. It turned out there wasn't any kind of fight since Adora turned into a 6.5-foot tall humanoid wolf monster, which is apparently not something that most, if any, other werewolves can do. It looked like she was ready to tear off the vampire's head, which is when the vampire decided to surrender to the very large vampire man who had been floating in the river that ran along Grandpa's property waiting for the rogue vampire to show up. Seriously, his shoulders were higher than the sheriff's head even in her half-wolf shape. Werewolves can sense people on their territory. But swimming onto their land without ever touching the ground can let people of all sorts sneak in. So much for the vampires and flowing water thing. Although, he didn't cross flowing water. He just swam along it. All the volunteers that showed up to back up the newest werewolf in town ended up just helping a bunch of confused state cops, truckers, and people who had been at a fast food restaurant when the vampire decided she needed a mob. They helped get everyone home with a cover story that was mind-controlled into them by the other vampires who showed up to deal with the intruder. But Grandpa still wanted to say thanks. Which is why I found him the day before the party digging a pit out behind the kitchen terrace back where he usually set up the old, rusty cut in half from top to bottom steel barrel he puts a grill on top of to do his outdoor cooking. "What are you doing?" The old man looked up at me from the deep pit. He had managed to get himself pretty filthy while throwing the dirt up out of the pit, which my little brother Aaron was turning the far side of into a series of ramps and roads for his little metal cars. Digging a pit? He gave me a challenging look. I tried to outstare him, but he just grinned and proceeded to dig out a few more scoops of dirt. I sighed. He was in one of those moods. "Why are you digging a pit, Dot?" He grinned at me again as he stepped up out of the pit, then paused with a surprised look when he noticed Aaron playing in the dirt before he answered me. "Going to cook a pig, Hawaiian style." "Well, almost. I'm going to use corn husks instead of banana leaves. It's too expensive to get the leaves shipped in." Oh. I had known about the party for a while, and I had even been helping with the food. "I think that's steam cooking, right? It should be healthier that way. I think." He blinked at me a few times and nodded at me. I guess it would be. Then he tried to muss my hair, so I pushed him off balance, got a foot behind his ankle, and hip checked him into his pit. He yelped as he fell, "Careful, I'm old. I could break a hip." I rolled my eyes at him. "Werewolf, remember. You'll heal. Can I help?" He made a big show of rolling his eyes right back at me. "It's outdoor cooking, that is men's work, little girl. Besides, there's going to be a bunch of kids coming along, some of them are your own age. Including that boy from the grocery store." He wiggled his eyebrow at me. "You might want to pick out an outfit." I gave him a warning look. He just grinned again, before waving me off. "Get to know some of the kids you're going to be going to school with. Make some friends, flirt with some boys or girls, either way's good." I doubled down on the warning look. "Don't make me put you in the hole again, old man." He just made a sort of snarking sound of a laugh and started setting up a ring of cement blocks from a sturdier-looking version of a kid's little wagon. So I left him sew it and went off to help my dad and my older cousin Charles set up the tarps. My dad gave me a little insight while I stood there holding up a pole. He had gotten old enough that there were a lot of things he couldn't do anymore. Now that he can, he wants to enjoy not needing anyone's help. "Oh. That makes sense." I gave my dad a long look. "He chased you off too, didn't he?" My cousin Charles started chuckling. My dad nodded. He took the time to explain it to me so I didn't feel rejected. He just wanted to tease." He shook his head at me. "You might want to do something about that at some point, or else it's always going to be him picking on you to show his affection." As I stood around holding up the support poles while the men hammered in the stake, well, my dad pretty much stomped them in while Charles tied the support ropes, I realized I was going to have it out with the old man. I didn't mind the teasing. But if he could explain things to my dad to make sure he didn't hurt his son's feelings, he could do the same to me. But not today, with him getting ready for his party. And certainly not when he was sitting down on the ground listening to my brother explain something about what he was working on in the dirt with such a serious expression on his 5-year face. But soon. Meanwhile, I had to finish helping set up, then get to sleep so I could wake up early enough to help make some of the dishes. Then I would change clothes and do something with my hair. And not because Nate and his family were going to be here. It was because I was going right from homeschooling to the 7th grade in a new school with high school kids, due to the junior high being closed years ago to save money. Tomorrow, I was going to have to establish the pecking order with high school werewolf girls. I got up early the next day to help in the kitchen, but before I could do anything else, I got ambushed by my mom. "We can do something with your hair if you want to. No pressure, really, it's all your choice." We went up the main stairs in the entrance, the ones that hardly ever got used since Mom knew I didn't want Ami there making comments while my mom tried to do something with what was left of my hair. Up until I was 11 I had long black hair like my mom's mom, until I started training with my uncle and it just kept getting in the way, and because I didn't want it cut short like my mom's. We had a problematic relationship when I was a kid. My mom had gotten used to doing things her own way, which often only made sense to her, and my dad let her get away with it since he was often gone for days at a time. Now that I was older, our relationship had changed. More like a mentor and a student than the tyrant and the horribly oppressed child. She frowned at me in the mirror and tapped me on the top of my head. "Hold still, I still have to get the other side." I eyed the curling iron suspiciously, there was a lot of heat coming off of it. Mom wasn't putting in curls but what she called waves, which made my hair have sort of ripples that made it look bigger rather than lying flat. She did this by wrapping some of my hair around the iron and pulling on it, which sort of hurt. Comparing the two sides, the other still being flat, I kind of liked it. "Can I wear makeup?" That got me another finger tap, a little harder, and a sharp look at me in the mirror again. "When you turn 15, you can start wearing a little bit for practice." I sighed. The other girls my age are wearing makeup. I hadn't met any of them yet, but it could be true. My mom rolled her eyes. "The other girls your age turn into wolves, a wolf wearing lipstick would be silly." I tried to imagine Grandpa's girlfriend in her 6.5-foot tall werewolf form with bright red lips while doing a pose, which got another finger tap to stop me from giggling. When Mom was finally satisfied and released me, it was time to pick out my outfit. I didn't want to go too fancy since this was a barbecue, and I didn't have anything fancy anyways. So I spent the next hour picking through and trying on various combinations of what I had available. I finally settled on my light green tank top and a set of faded jean shorts that fit me fairly well. The top matched some of the colors of my eyes and made my skin tone look more like a copper color than just dark. The only jewelry I had was the half-heart-shaped necklace my grandpa had once bought for my grandma Brianna back when they were together, which I was not going to wear and have to listen to him go on about me wearing it. I had offered it back to Grandma Brianna once, but she had just looked a little sad as she smiled and told me to keep it since it hadn't belonged to her in a long, long time. Before I headed downstairs, I focused on my ears as I took in a breath, then exhaled to let my magic flow from my core to circle around my head, calming my mind and allowing me to reach out with my senses. In the distance I could hear car doors being closed, and the sounds of voices other than my family. Our guests had begun to arrive. The technique to improve my senses was not something the Ichiban side of my family used, but something I had come up with for myself. My uncle had taught me another technique that could sharpen all of your senses, but it wasn't as strong. On the other hand, it didn't make you deaf if there was a sudden loud noise. Mine only lasted a few moments, but I could call it up as needed. But then I was the granddaughter, the grandniece, and the great-granddaughter of witches. I had more magic than anyone on the Ichiban side of my family. It was only enough to make me into at most a weak witch, especially compared to my sister Ami, but it made me a very good magical warrior. Witches, and other magic workers, do magic that affects the world around them. Magical warriors do magic that affects themselves. Having weaker magic made it easier to use it on ourselves. Ami's magic is too big for her to hold inside, which is why she was making things fly around on their own before she started training with the witches. Now she does it on purpose. Downstairs I grabbed the big clear glass garden salad bowl and headed outside to the table that Grandpa had covered with ice and towels under a tarp to keep the cold dishes from warming up. Which is when I spotted the girl that would become my frenemy for the next 4 years. I would later know her as Dolores Sanders, granddaughter of Adora Carras, the town sheriff and leader in denial of the local werewolves. As well as my grandpa's girlfriend. Right then she was just the chunky blonde in the skimpy summer dress that was arm in arm with Neil Evans. The guy who I had let my mom go at my hair with a heated metal rod for. Neil sort of froze in place when he noticed me noticing him and her. His eyes slowly turned to look down at his arm, which the green-eyed blonde in a red rose-patterned summer dress who had hooked her own arm around. Then he developed a look of nervous realization that crossed over his face as he began to try to squirm free. The blonde gave him a questioning look and used her other hand to reach over to try to hang on to him, grinning as the two of them began to sort of wrestle in place. She finally looked up to see where he was looking and finally saw me as Neil tried to give me a pleading look. She seemed confused at first, but she must have seen something in my face as she looked from me to Neil, then back at me again before grinning again as she began whispering quietly to Neil and bumping him away from her. I think she assumed that since I wasn't a werewolf I wouldn't be able to hear her whisper. "Oh, I see, going for the rich girl, huh?" At that moment I really wanted to turn around and stomp off, maybe just to see if Neil would chase me down or not. But I would not back down in front of an opponent. Especially not from a top-heavy, big-haired werewolf. I had read a few articles and watched some nature videos. Grandpa had said werewolves were just people inside their heads, no matter what form they were in. But he also said a lot of the werewolves tried to act like wolves because they thought they were supposed to. So I ignored Neil, walked up to the blonde, and held out my hand. Which was both social, and would let me start with a good grip on her if she started something. "Hi, I'm Sarah. John Lath's granddaughter. Welcome to my land." The blonde girl tilted her head at me in curiosity but didn't hesitate to shake my hand with a crooked smile. "Del Sanders. My grandma's the sheriff, and even if she wasn't, it's not like everyone in the town hasn't heard everything about you and your family. She gave my hand a brief squeeze. I know it's a stupid boy thing, but grandmother said you were strong, so I'm curious just how strong you are. She gave my hand another squeeze, letting up this time. Care to give it a try? I hesitated while she stared me right in the eye, then twisted myself free of her fingers while pushing my hand against her to lift them both up flat between us. Let's just push against each other's hands. It's how my family tests both strength and balance at the same time. She looked a little intrigued and shuffled her legs to brace herself, before beginning to push. I matched with a better stance, but didn't try to throw her off balance. All I did was match her, and then steadily push harder. It wasn't too surprising that she was matching me. She was the granddaughter of the woman who all the werewolves in this town respected for her power. So I kept pressing, and she kept matching. For a moment I could see some concern in her eyes, then some interest as she grinned and leaned into the push. We may even have been fairly matched. Until I breathed in, and let my chi flow through my body. Down my legs to anchor me, up my back and shoulders to brace me, and finally down my arms to empower me. Her eyes went a little wide as I slowly began to press her hand back. For a second she even began to look panicked. From somewhere over by the bare patch of ground with a circle of logs around it spray painted to warn people not to step on the buried roasting pig, I could hear my father whisper. Not some words of wisdom. Just a simple reminder. Her brother Dare bled for us when he came to help defend our house. Don't humiliate his little sister. I eased up and pulled my hand away. Looks like you're pretty strong, but your curse set a limit on how strong you can be. My training lets me put more of my personal magic into my strength when I need to push my limits. The blonde girl got a confused look, then looked a little offended. My curse? I felt a little embarrassed. That's what my aunt calls it. She says it's a transferable spell and no one normally bothers to do magic that way other than for a curse. But my aunt isn't very nice, so I'm sorry if calling it that is offensive. Shrugging, I explained, the only werewolf I've had a chance to talk to is my grandpa, and he is either too new at this to know, or he makes stuff up so I don't know what to believe. Like, do you guys really hear wolves howling when the moon rises? Like a lot of them, even when no one else is anywhere near you? Dell started to answer, then looked over to where Neil had been standing, before she began looking all around. Darn it, he got away. She looked at me as set her hands on her hips. He gets shy around crowds. That's why I was hanging on to his arm like that. If you don't keep a hold of him, he'll vanish on you. She crossed her arms and gave a crooked smile. But if you can find him first and keep a hold of him, I won't fight you for him. At least not for today. That sort of called out for further explanation, but standing around chatting would just give Neil a better chance to hide. I gave Dell a nod and headed off to cheat. Grandpa, can you tell me where Neil is, without teasing me? Grandpa was standing near the fire pit along with my dad and my cousin Charles, who had begun to slowly open his mouth and raise a finger, but I was already familiar with his sense of humor. Same goes for you. Then I shot a narrow-eyed glare at my father, who did his best to look innocent. Despite normally being on my side, the Lathe family's curse of dad jokes had begun to infect him. Chuckling at the ground as his eyes began to look a bit unfocused, Grandpa outed the location of the only person my age in town that I had spoken to more than once. He's found his way down to the exercise room. Looks like the kid's got a strong back. I could see him begin to say something else, then stop himself with a grin and a slow shake of his head. His parents will be here soon with the baked goods, and they will probably want him to help unload. Get going if you want a chance to talk. As I dashed off, I could hear my dad mutter. Better just be talking. I hesitated for a second as I realized that was more than me enhancing my hearing, he was projecting his voice somehow. With a stern promise to myself to pry how to do that out of him later on, I pushed off to talk to the boy. Took the stairs down with a bit of chi going down to my feet with a certain twist to it. The Ichiban called a technique something that translated into English as the elusive footsteps of the shadows, but my uncle said to just call it shadow walking. It was not only quiet but didn't leave marks on the ground. My uncle was much better at it than me, so much better that he could use it to walk on water. Which he said was pretty much useless since it tired you out pretty fast to use it at that level. And he had no interest in founding a religion. Before I even got down the stairs I could hear the sound of metal clattering on metal, and in the weight room I could see Neil stepping back in confusion from the reinforced weight bench Grandpa had custom made to handle the similarly specially made barbell and weights. You aren't supposed to lift without a spotter. Neil jerked in place as he fought the urge to jump, and he took in a sharp sudden breath as he turned around wide-eyed. How did you do that? Shadow walking also did something to block your scent, something I learned while sneaking up on Sheriff Karras to try to ask her embarrassing questions about what were her intentions with my grandpa. I also learned not to ask Sheriff Karras such questions as she considered 13 years old to be mature enough to give honest, overly detailed answers to. EW. Even if it wasn't two old people, let alone her and my grandfather. Anyways, he asked. So I wiggled my fingers around. Magic. But seriously, it's a real rule, you need a spotter or you can't use the weights here. He blinked at me a few times, and then looked a little awkward. Sorry, it's just that I didn't think it would weigh that much. I've got to try one of the school's weight sets, but even with all the weights on the bar, it wasn't that heavy. I went over and took a quick look at the weights. It's got 800 on it right now, my dad must have left it set for my grandpa. He can probably lift more, but Grandpa says he only works out for maintenance, not to push himself. Neil started to talk, then shook his head and grinned. I'm not going to start talking about how much I can lift, I don't think you'll care, and I don't want to find out if you can lift more. I gave him a quick glance and a grin, then looked away. So then why did you come down here? He frowned a little. It's going to sound creepy. I turned to give him a guarded look. What do you mean? He leaned back against the barbell. It's a werewolf thing, you might not like it. I reached out to smack him lightly on the arm. Talk, or I abandon you to your girlfriend. He straightened up while looking a little upset. She's not my girlfriend, we've just known each other forever, and I was the only one to stand by her when her family got in trouble. I held my hands up to show him I was backing off from teasing him. He huffed some air out as he calmed himself down. She's a little clingy because everyone else only started to come around when made it clear I still considered her a friend. Neither one of us are interested in or old enough to be dating, and I'm stronger than the older guys, so making it seem like we're together keeps her from having to knock them around to make them behave themselves. But we are just friends. I nodded along as if I understood. It seemed pretty complected to me. But between being high schoolers and werewolves it was probably hard to explain. We both took a moment to calm down before I finally asked. So what was the creepy reason you came down here? He blushed a little. It smelled like you spent a lot of your time down here, I guess from working out here, and I figured it probably wasn't going to your bedroom down here. We took another moment before I nodded again. You're right. That is pretty creepy. Then I gave him a smile after he started looking worried to let him off the hook. I decided I definitely needed to have a talk with Grandpa's girlfriend again. Time about what kinds of soap and antiperspirants were good to use around werewolves. And maybe ask about perfumes and how much to use. Before Neil got the call to come help his parents empty out their truck, I managed to get the story on why Dell's family issues had made her a social outcast for a while. My next-door neighbor, Dare, the sheriff's grandson, was also Dell's older brother. Dare had been not only kicked out of her family's home when he came out as gay, but got struck by his father before being thrown out. That was the night everyone in town, including Sheriff Karras, found out she could take on what my grandpa had taken to calling a war form. She had run across town after turning into a half-wolf, half-human form, kicked down her son's front door, and picked him off the ground by the neck with one hand to tell him he was disowned the same way he had just disowned his own son. She had made a point of greeting her daughter-in-law, the next oldest child, Dell, and the younger sister in public to make it clear she still considered them to be family. But up to then, Dell had been the town princess, and a lot of the girls were more than happy to see her taken down a notch. I guess either my dad was pretty well informed about the local gossip since he warned me not to embarrass her in our test of strength, or he saw something in her that made it seem like a bad idea. But then he had grown up in a small town, with just a handful of families or so. So it isn't too much of a surprise that he knows the rules of a small community better than me. After that, Neil got a call to help his parents unload their van. Neil's family owns the local grocery store, which has a full-sized bakery, and sells all sorts of other odds and ends. Which is why Grandpa chose them to order a bunch of biscuits, donuts, pies, cookies, and loaves of bread for the party. Along with a ton of various deli luncheon meats and cheeses. To go with the roasted pig, deep-fried turkeys, hamburgers, hot dogs, and sausages. I accused him of planning to put people into a food coma, to keep anyone from trying to pick a fight with him, to try to prove something. All that did was make him look thoughtful. The reality is that the old man is just so happy to eat like a pig without it killing him at his age, or making him fat, and that he just really enjoys seeing people eat food that he provided. Everyone keeps telling me that with the amount of training and exercise that I go through that, I could eat like that too. But just the thought of eating like that all the time just feels wrong. Maybe it's because we only ate like that at home when my dad was there. When he was off on a work trip, which was like half my life, we ate more traditional stuff at home. Lots of rice, noodles, fish, and steamed vegetables. It's just what's normal for me. I had also gotten on a bit of a health food obsession. Maybe just as a form of teenage rebellion, but now I was sort of stuck with it since dropping it entirely would get me teased. Plus some of it I really did like. Whole grain bread had a richer taste to it, while white bread is sweet but kind of flavorless. At least the store brand stuff. Mrs. Evans, Neil's mom, makes some seriously good baked goods, even the not dessert stuff like plain old bread. But at least half of that is the lack of preservatives. After following Neil out help him and his parents carry in the baked goods, some to the serving tables for the people coming in early enough for a separate lunch, and some into the garage with a few tarps hung up and an old air conditioner making a cold room, I got to play some games. With people that could play at my level. Volleyball was a lot more fun with other people who could jump higher than the net, and then I got to play tag with people I had to push myself to get away from or to chase down who weren't related to me. Between those games, I played a few rounds of horseshoes and bocce ball with some of the older people. Which is when I found out accuracy is not something that came with all the other powers werewolves got. But it turns out an entire childhood of playing games with my mom's family that were meant to prepare children for training in martial arts later on in life did give me an edge. Even Ami was better at a lot of the games, she just tired out quicker than the children her age who had been born as werewolves, even if they were too young to turn into wolves yet. It wasn't until halfway through the afternoon that I noticed that Neil had been carefully making sure that me and Dell were always on the same team, or never in direct competition with each other. When I figured it out, I gave the taller blonde girl a look to which she slowly nodded in return, having figured it out before me. We agreed without a word that it was probably for the best. I didn't want to challenge her position as a top supernatural girl, and she didn't see a need to try to prove she was better than me. For now, at least we could both live with that. My dad had also spotted this as he whispered, "Clever boy," to Neil from behind while walking past him with shadow steps. Which made the teenage werewolf visibly nervous. Good, that means he's smart as well as clever. Despite having a perfectly good indoor, in-ground swimming pool that wouldn't leave you smelling like fish afterwards, everyone wanted to swim in the part of the river that ran alongside Grandpa's house that was wide enough to be a lake. At least a long, somewhat long, narrow lake. I tried a Google search once, but I couldn't find a name for anything like it. It wasn't dammed or anything. It had just been widened out to make a real river bank on one side so you could walk along it or have a solid place to dive into it, since the other side was all marshy with cattails and other such plants. Most people had brought along swimsuits since Grandpa said he had a pool and what he had decided to call a swimming hole, but some people were nervous to go into the river since they had seen a 7-foot-something vampire jump out of it during what they had been calling the rescue. But I was pretty sure that guy was long gone now, and it wasn't like he was going to pop up in daylight. Even with the protective outfit he had on against what sunlight could reach him during the day. I put on a sort of sports bra swimsuit top, but I wore one of my jean shorts over the bottoms. Neil just took off his shirt and shoes and jumped in the deep water just off the dock, which meant he would be wearing wet underwear and shorts for the rest of the day. Dell had a yellow bikini on, which was barely on up top. But I wasn't going to think about that. I am much happier with my athletic figure. She grinned at me when she caught up with us from changing in the house and I had climbed out of the water for another dive off the dock. Then gave me a considering look. It's okay. You can make a joke about the smell of wet dogs. Then she nodded slowly at me. I stared back at her for a moment, and then we exchanged grins. What about sticking your head out of car windows, or walking around in a circle 3 times before you can lie down? She laughed, I laughed, she pointed over at a nervous-looking Neil, and we both laughed some more. Alright, now I had 2 people my age I had talked to in this town. Also, swimming is not an innate talent for werewolves either, but at least they aren't limited to doggy paddling. I did get to meet a lot more people who were around my age, as well as some of the younger kids. And not all of them were werewolves. While this party was mainly for people in the community, they also had wives and husbands who were just plain old humans. As well as stepkids and some people who just didn't inherit the condition from their parents. My Aunt Rosaria said it was most likely they just didn't have enough magic in them for the curse to take hold. Aaron got dragged into playing with the littler kids by the little girl from next door, Melinda, while Ami met some of the girls and boys she would be going to school with if her training for the rest of the summer went well. Which, considering that she managed to set fire to a patch of the woods behind the garage showing off her magic to the other children, meant her progress wasn't looking so good. Grandpa had ordered an entire pallet of fire extinguishers, some extra hoses, and fire blankets once it had been settled that Ami was going to be trained at his house that summer. As well as some tarps. He had also wanted to get some fireworks for the party. Large, loud fireworks. But his girlfriend, the sheriff, had pointed out that almost everything he was looking at was illegal in Michigan, and loud fireworks didn't go well with werewolf hearing. So instead it was fountain fireworks, sparklers, and some of those paper lanterns that float up in the air as a candle heat up the air inside of them at the end of the night before the people with children headed home. He had planned to set up something to let the kids paint them, but Mom convinced him that half of them would end up getting upset when they didn't get to keep them, so instead he got some piñatas. Which Mom again had to have a talk with him about filling up little kids with sugar just before sending them home. So the piñatas got filled up with some candy, but mostly party treats. A lot of which were noisemakers like kazoos, which I'm sure sensitive hearing werewolf parents were just going to love on the ride home, but Mom gave up at that point. Later that night I got to sit around a campfire with the teens while the adults with designated drivers or those planning on getting home on all fours stayed up finishing off the kegs Grandpa had brought in. I ended up sitting pretty close to Neil and talking quietly with him for a while before my dad showed up and said it was getting late. Me and Dad were going to have a conversation pretty soon about setting down some new rules on what I'm allowed to do as a teenager, otherwise, when would I going to know it was worth breaking them? Once the big party was out of the way, it was time for my little sister Ami to start her magic training. Which for some reason I had to sit in on. My grandmother, Brianna Kane, explained to me, "You are strong enough to do the basics, and a familiarity with what a witch can do may come in handy if you do decide to do the same kind of work as your parents." Then she reached out to brush her hand along my hair. "I can't teach you how to fight, at least let me do this." "Darn it, Grandma, that isn't fighting fair." Then she grinned. "And besides, it will be a good thing to spend some time with your sister before you end up going to 2 different schools." She rolled her eyes. "And Rosaria will teach you how to fight other witches. That's more her thing." Ami, of course, got upset since this was supposed to be her thing. But I think that she was secretly relieved to have someone else suffering with her. My sister definitely wanted to get her magic under control. If she didn't, she would be homeschooled for at least a year, and even without that hanging over her head, magic was something she wanted to learn. But I think everything else that went with magic, the expectations and responsibilities to our families, was a little overwhelming for an 11-year-old. My grandmother decided to teach us outside in the gazebo that sat off in a small flower garden. I knew from the original plans for the estate it was supposed to be a fountain at the center of a huge elaborate garden with a hedge maze surrounding it on 3 sides, but all my grandpa was willing to pay for was some flower beds around the nice, but much cheaper wooden structure with a nice coat of white paint. Alright you two, the first thing you need to learn is how to piece the veil. Outside the bounds of this world is the everything. In the everything, anything is possible. That's what magic is, taking what is possible in the everything, and making it happen here. The more magical power you have, the more you can make happen. The more training you have, the more you can choose what will happen. Grandma looked at Ami, you have so much magic in you, that you are making things happen without choosing what happens. And you are so strong you can't focus your magic down to something you can contain within yourself. Then she looked at me. Your magic is right at the limit of not being able to contain it within yourself. Your grandfather may have been the same way. Or at least that's why I think he's so strong as a werewolf. She looked off towards my grandpa's house. If John had been trained, he could have resisted the curse like any other spell trying to sink into him. Who knows how strong your father? Then her eyes went wide and she began talking about the dangers of the everything and the things that lived in it. How it was important not to let your mind wander when you reached out to touch it, lest something follow you back. Over the next 2 weeks, me and my sister had lessons for roughly 2 hours before and after lunch. I didn't learn all that much about how to do magic, but I did learn a lot about magic. My aunt, who technically was my grand aunt Rosaria, took a different approach during her 2 weeks as our tutor. Out on the driveway in front of the house, she pointed over to where she had spent the last few minutes sticking dozens of sticks into the ground. Alright girls. Let's set stuff on fire. It turns out that for the absolute simplest of the spells you didn't have to use a ritual to reach out across the brain between reality and the flux of all possibilities. Just picture what you wanted to happen, and push your magic at it. It was only a step above what Ami had been doing by accident, but for this, it was by choice. My sister is trying to teach you two to run before you can walk. The best way to take control of your magic is to use it, to wreak things. Now burn something. I did in fact, learn how to light a piece of wood on fire with a few moments to concentrate. But by the end of Rosaria's 2 weeks of tutoring, Ami was creating little balls of fire in the palm of her hands and shooting them at the logs. Which she was insufferably smug about. However, the first lesson came to an end with Aunt Rosaria and my father in a screaming argument over what he described as her trying to burn down another house and what she described as him being a wimp. From her glance at me and Ami, I don't think that was the word she was originally planning to use. This was nothing new. My aunt was only a month older than my dad, and they were more like siblings than aunt and nephew. Siblings that didn't get along. While they were arguing, Grandpa dragged out a hose with a spray nozzle on the end. Morning, Rosaria. You should have come in, we had bacon. My aunt gave him a distracted nod. He then pointed over to where some skid marks were on his driveway. No one ever called me or came looking for that car you left here. Had to get it taken care of myself. She began making excuses as he held up his hand. I understand, getting punched that hard must have shaken you up pretty bad. But I would appreciate it if you could clean up your messes before you made any more. My aunt glared at him for a moment before Ami slipped up next to her and clung to her arm. Looking up sadly at her aunt. Aunt Rosie, please be nice. We just got him. I couldn't have pulled that off. But then the skid marks were from when I had punched Aunt Rosaria into her rental car hard enough to scoot it sideways with enough force to leave the 2 black marks on the cement. She hadn't been mad about it, in fact at the time she had looked a little thrilled that I could do it, but I didn't want to bring it up. Aunt Rosie rolled her eyes. Fine, but I'm going to use it as a lesson and make these two do the work. Grandpa smiled with a twinkle in his eyes. Oh, by all means. That's what young people are for. Then he patted my dad on the shoulder. Now why don't you come with me and help me convince your gal that she doesn't have to clean up after breakfast all the time. Even if the work staff has lessons to get to. By the end of the summer I could reliably light a candle from across a room, chill a drink in less than a minute, dimly light up a room, dry my hair with a warm breeze, and a few other tricks that my grandmother and my aunt called basic magic. Opening a lock, nope. Can't see the tumblers. Influence someone's mind, no idea how to start. Anything too abstract, and I just couldn't do it. Learning a new way to give myself an ability to do things became a lot easier with witch training, but I just didn't have the right mindset to do most of the things in the world around me that Grandma said were within my strength. At least I didn't have to train with great-grandmother. She didn't consider me worth the effort. Ami always looked tired when she came home from her 2 weeks in Wisconsin. You are so lucky. My younger sister held up her hands, fingers curled up like claws. I have to memorize so many plants, what they do, and how to harvest them. Then, she gave me a horrified look. I have to learn Latin. I did sympathize with her on that. After her first 2 weeks with great-grandpa, I had to start learning it too. My grandma Brianna had no sympathy. I think it might help to know what someone is trying to do when they start chanting, since they might be trying to do it to you. Grandpa encouraged me as well. It's my understanding that the name Cain is well known and feared. I'm thinking that if you identify yourself as a Cain to someone who means you harm, then point at them and start saying scary stuff in Latin, it might be enough to get things done without a fight. He nodded to himself. Especially if your sister gets well known. If they see an Asian girl named Cain, it's not like they'll know which one you are. Why are you looking at me all angry? I explained to him that I wanted to be known as me, not Ami Cain's sister. He just smiled at me. I doubt they'll make the same mistake twice after you get done with them. I thought that one over. Okay, you're forgiven. 3 times over the summer I spent 2 weeks at the Ichiban family estate back in California focusing on my training with my Uncle Dave and up against my cousins. I had never noticed it before, but I'm stronger than my cousins, even the older boys. They don't like it, especially since the more they get upset, the more Uncle Dave laughed at them. It's a teaching moment, aim them at a window next time, Sarah. In the past, I assumed they were stronger than me because they were boys. Now I know it was just because I was younger than them, and hadn't come into my power. I was told by Uncle Dave not to show off any of the tricks I had learned to do with magic. It's real magic, but... He shook his head. It's not combat magic, that's something I'll have to call a friend to teach you. I'll make arrangements for that at some point, but your dad's family is just too strong to teach you what you can do with magic at your level. Ami didn't care, she was giggling like crazy as she used to do when she was younger, while Aaron stuck to the kiddie rides. My parents seemed more than content with the kiddie rides as well, probably since they only had to look after one kid while Grandpa took us 2 girls on the real ride. And bought us way too much junk food. Really, Sarah? This is a vacation, calories don't count. I think that he saw that something was going on with me, and reached out to poke the back of my neck with a finger which had become ice cold from his drink. My neck for once wasn't protected since my hair was bunched up in a ball cap. He had up until then mainly limited himself to trying to mess with my hair, but the old blue hat I had found in the attic storage room with the Gothic capital D had forced him to get inventive. I squealed in surprise, which caused him to freeze, giving me time to grab his finger and twist his arm around in a lock and hiss. Don't ever do that again. He winced, but was still grinning. Okay. But what's really bugging you? I let him go while he muttered something about see what happens the next time you pull my finger. It's the VIP pass, it doesn't seem right that we're getting to skip in front of everyone else. Not just because you got money. My grandfather got that faraway look while he thought about that. I had to jerk on his arm with the VIP gesturing at us that it was our turn to get him on the suspended roller coaster. He somehow kept the same look on his face for the entire ride, despite Ami screaming in his ear the entire time. After getting off the ride, he finally was ready to talk. There are a lot of excuses for me spending the money to do this, which other people don't have, but I'm going to skip to the heart of the matter. It's my money. I looked at him, and he shrugged. I earned it by buying a lotto ticket. I may have only won by luck, assisted by your grandma, but I still risked my own money to buy a ticket. I took the risk, I get to enjoy the rewards. If anyone is in the wrong, blame the park for making cutting line for cash available. That didn't sound entirely right to me. But couldn't you use that money to help people? He sighed at me. I did. Several people I knew are living better lives without having to worry about losing their homes as they get older or get hurt. People who were there for me when I needed help. Outside of them? He sighed again. Most charities end up being scams one way or another, but I tell you what. He looked down at me and gave me a sad smile. When I'm gone, you will have a chunk of money coming from me that you can do whatever you want with. Give it away, get something you want that you didn't want to waste the money you earned working. Whatever ever you think is best, until then don't worry about how I spend it while it's still mine. Now let's get some ice cream. Ami, who had been listening in quietly let out a cheer, then began to complain when Grandpa said she had to try something other than chocolate. How else are you going to find out what else you like, or hate? Both of them ignored my complaints that we had just finished off a cone of honey-roasted nuts. Not that I complained too long, it was a vacation. My great-uncle, or grunkle, Drew, Charles's dad, arrived the day before the combination family reunion, housewarming, and birthday party. On his own 2 feet. Drew had lost his right leg to diabetes years ago, and my grandpa had bitten him to turn him into a werewolf, with his consent, to see if the health benefits of magically powered health and shape changing would restore a limb that had been lost before becoming a werewolf. It did, as well as making him skinnier, and even making him younger looking. It also made him confident enough to grab hold of me and lift me up in the air while hugging me, even shaking my legs side to side as he did so. Sarah girl. Happy 14th Eve. Oof. Grunkle Drew. Put me down, I'm too big to be picked up. I managed to pry myself loose without hurting him, mainly since he let go of me. He looked down at me with a proud smile, and a little bit of sadness in his eyes. I didn't get the chance to pick you up when you were younger and smaller, and I wasn't going to try it with only one real leg to stand on. Then he looked over at Ami and Aaron, who had caught up to me in front of the garage in time to see me get lifted. With a predatory smile, he took a step in their direction, sending both of them running with a scream, Ami, and giggles, Aaron. Run children, run. The big bad wolf is coming for you. There will be hugs. Getting his leg back had turned him into a different man, or maybe just back into the man I had never had the chance to meet. My great-grandmother had been pretty upset when her daughter, her one and only heir, had run off to go to college and then came back pregnant. She had only agreed to not kill my grandpa if Grandma Brianna agreed to never see or contact him again. So I never knew any of this part of my family until I showed up at Grandpa's front gate. And tomorrow I was going to have to meet just about all of them that were still left. All the while being the mysterious granddaughter who had showed up out of nowhere just after the youngest brother in their family had won the lottery. My dad's family consisted of some of the strongest magic wielders in the world. My mom's family consisted of an entire clan of magic warriors. But I was still freaking out over a group of people that aside from my grandpa and his brother were all normal people. Well, Charles was dating a vampire, but she couldn't attend the party, even after it got dark. Werewolves and vampires didn't socialize, at least not in person. Vampires smelled really bad to werewolves, while werewolves smelled delicious to vampires. That would make it awkward at a party. I had met Nicole, Charles's girlfriend, on Skype. She seemed nice and was pretty too. Grabbing some of Grunkle's Drew's bags out of the car, I caught up with him, Ami, and Aaron just in time to see him chase Ami into the house and hand off a squealing Aaron from under his arm off to my mom. I'll get you later little girl, you'll have to come out for food. Most of the rest of that day was taken up with food, either preparing it, watching for the deliveries, or helping to put the whole dear Grunkle Drew had brought with him into the cooking pit. My grandpa's only sister had married a Jewish man, so no roast pig or bacon. My grandpa had sighed when he complained about the sacrifices we make for family. Of course, we had bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches for lunch, and pork chops, cheesy potatoes with diced bacon, and green beans for dinner. Mom had to stop Grandpa from putting bacon in with the green beans. Enough John, we get it. I would like to enjoy something else as well. She did like the almond slivers and fried onions in the green beans though. She scooped out some on a bed of rice she had added to the dinner since Grandpa had learned to let her make something for the family dinners, or she got upset and Dad would chew him out. Grandpa also ate the rice with every indication of really enjoying it, without Dad having to tell him to do so. I don't give the old man much credit for it. If it was food set down in front of him, he was going to enjoy it. I did give him points for not adding anything to it other than the low-sodium soy sauce my mom had set out. I let my dad mention something about old dogs and new tricks the first time he let Mom make a whole meal. He had better timing than me. Got the old guy when he was drinking and made him choke to spit it out. I had bowed to the master. There was so much left for me to learn. Early the next morning I got woken up by my cousin Charles knocking on my door. I got stuck picking up my aunt and her people at the airport. You're coming with me so I don't have to answer everyone's questions repeatedly all morning. While I wanted to help get things ready, I knew waiting around all morning for these people, my family, would make me a nervous wreck. Okay, let me grab a shower. We headed out in the big white van Grandpa had rented for the weekend before the sun was fully up, which meant we had to stop along the way to get something to eat. As Charles had planned. We're getting McD's, my treat if you don't complain. I shrugged. He had never gotten on my case about me talking about healthy eating and then eating the same stuff as everyone else. So for once, I could eat what I wanted without the need to protest or risk getting teased. Besides, they had pancakes. Can I try a coffee? He nodded. Put a lot of sugar and creamer in it if you haven't tried it before. You got to kind of work your way up to drinking the stuff. When we got up to the pickup window, he asked for extra sugar and creamer. It's her first try at coffee. I glared at him. She didn't need to know that. He just grinned at me. It's not like you're ever going to see her again. Strangers are great for telling things that you aren't ready to talk about to the people you know. A half hour later, we got to the empty Pleasant Airport, parked, and rode the shuttle to the airport to wait for the flight in from New Hampshire by way of Detroit. When the older couple got off the plane, with their children's spouses, and their grandchildren, the older woman walked straight over to me, utterly ignoring Charles as he tried to make introductions. Oh God. You do have her eyes. Then my grand aunt, or would it be Grunt, Lois hugged me tightly. At least she didn't try to pick up in the air, despite having 4 inches on me. That put her solidly in place as my number 2 old person on this branch of my family tree, and not that far behind Grandpa Lave. We got some of my great-aunt's family's luggage loaded up in the white van, then me and Charles followed them on their shuttle bus to a rental lot where we had another SUV ready in order to get everyone into a vehicle with all their stuff. Grunt Lois, as she insisted I call her since Grunkle Drew had told her that granduncles had their own titles, dragged her husband along behind her and practically shoved him in the passenger seat of the van before loading herself into the front bench seat and patting the spot beside her while looking at me. You hear, grandchildren, pile in the back. The younger girl, Erica, squirmed in between me and her grandmother while looking up at me with a wide smile, while the oldest of the boys, Paul, who was about 4 years older than me, pulled the sliding door shut, and then put himself into the rearmost bench while he pulled out his phone. Dad had told me if I was going into the family business that memorizing names and backgrounds was important, so I had studied the files he had put together from social media. Charles pulled out of the rental lot while keeping an eye over his shoulder to make sure he didn't lose the other car on the way back to Grandpa's place. Grunt Lois twisted sideways in her seat to look at me, now a bit more suspicious than bewildered. So, what's the story? I took a deep breath and then sighed. I was given a cover story. About my great-grandmother Endora and my grandma Brianna having to go into witness protection at the same time Grandma Bree found out she was pregnant. But I don't see any point in lying. Shrugging, I reached out to take one of Grunt Lois's hands. Your brother Drew has his leg back, he regrew it so it's a real flesh and blood leg. How that happened is going to be explained tonight, as is a lot of other stuff. So I don't see any point in lying to you with the cover story. Your family, and Grandpa Lathe is going to fill all of you in on everything anyways. Aunt Lois raised an eyebrow at me, then looked over at the back of Charles's head. Are you in on this, Chuck? Because I'll hit. Charles shook his head. I'm sticking with the witness protection story. It's plausible, and I can claim not to know the whole story. Besides, I'm driving, so no hitting. If we get into an accident, we can't regrow legs. Grunt Lois's husband Samuel twisted around in his seat enough to look back at me. I actually like the witness protection part, but please do tell us how Drew got his leg back. Some kind of advanced prosthesis? Cloning? I shook my head a little. Bitten by a werewolf. Samuel laughed, while his wife gave me a sharp look and pulled her hand free to try to swat at me. The little girl Erica seemed excited. Uncle Drew's a werewolf? I smiled. And looked down at her. And your cousin Charles is dating a vampire. Charles snapped out a hey. From the driver's seat. Keep it to one big reveal per day, we don't want to overwhelm them. Lois rolled her eyes. Well, I'm glad he's dating someone. Do we get to meet her? There shouldn't be issues anymore with my dad gone. My aunt said that a little sad. Her father had not done well in meeting Charles's girlfriend for the first time from what I had been told, just because she was black. Not openly hostile, just distant and cold. The man had died before I was 2. Considering that I'm not white either, I'm glad I didn't meet him, but then again, maybe meeting me as his great-grandchild might have allowed him to change for the better. Charles put his blinker on, change of subject, who wants IHOP? Ignoring anyone's possible objections, he pulled into the restaurant's parking lot and began to hastily exit the vehicle. My treat. Erica began to eagerly exit the vehicle while I looked steadily at Grunt Lois. Giving me a sharp look, she told her husband, without looking away from me, Sam, take the kids inside, will you? Me and Sarah need a moment. Paul seemed hesitant to leave, but the allure of surgery-fried chocolate-drizzled carbohydrates quickly lured the older teenage boy away. As Samuel pulled the sliding door shut, he gave his wife a questioning look before turning to help Charles herd his family toward the restaurant. Grunt Lois leaned back against the inside of the van with her arms crossed. All right, Sarah, tell me what sort of game my brothers are we playing this weekend? I held up my hand closed into a fist, then slowly opened it as I let the magic flow and spin into a small ball of greenish light. My family has always been magic. Then Grandpa Lath went and got bit by a werewolf all on his own, so now part of your family is magic too. This weekend your brothers want to make sure everyone in their family gets the chance to know about the supernatural, and if they want to take advantage of it. If you don't, you can choose to go home and forget about it. I held my hand flat and lifted towards her to offer him the chance to examine the light. Her arms had started to unfold, but she jerked back a little at first. Is it dangerous? I shook my head. It's just light. I only made it green because I like green. After a moment, she shook her head. Put it away, Sarah. I need to talk to my husband about this. I turned around and pulled the sliding door open so we could get out and followed her into the restaurant. I offered a hand to her to help her down from the van, but she waved me away with a snorting sound. Aunt Lois and her husband rode in one of the SUVs the rest of the way back to Grandpa's house, while I got to meet Erica's parents, my cousin Macy and her husband Rick. When we pulled into the drive and parked in the circle up front, Grunkle Drew came out the front door with Grandpa Lath just as Aunt Lois was getting out of the passenger seat of her car. She looked from her brother's pale legs revealed by his cargo shorts, then to me, before giving me a nod and walking up to her brother, ducking below his arms as he tried to hug her, and pinched his leg. Drew jumped back and began swatting at his sister with both hands. Ow! Lois? I just got that leg back, stop trying to tear it off, brat. My gray-haired grunt, a grandmother, began swatting right back at her white-haired elder brother. Shut up, my nails aren't even painted silver, Mr. Big Bad Wolf. You didn't tell me you got your leg back, and where the rest of your gut, fat boy. I had grown up with the serious dignity of the elders of my mother's family, or the almost sinister grimness of my oldest relative on my father's side. Seeing 2 old men trying to dodge away from their equally elderly sister's attempts to kick them in the shins. I had to cover my mouth to try to hold in the laughter. I really wished this sort of playfulness had always been part of my family, even with the rotten sense of humor that came with it. Since we still had people coming in, the rest of that morning turned into family story time while Ami showed off the house to Pete. Erica and Peter ran up and down the hallways or plunked down to play with the bin of toys Aaron had dragged down the steps so they could play right in the middle of the hallway. So my grandpa's family began when a man named Peter Lathe, who married a woman named Charity Olms after they both returned from the service after World War II. Peter talked his wife into naming their 3 sons after the disciples since his name was Peter. Andrew, who went by Drew, James, whose plane hadn't come in yet, and my grandpa John. Grunt Lois was the only girl and was born between James and John, and Charity demanded the right to get to name the girls since Peter had called dibs on the first 11 boys. Charity had liked comic books with a female lead. So she named her daughter after Lois Lane, which ensured that her daughter would stay far away from any sort of career in reporting. Instead, she became a legal secretary and met her husband at the office they both worked in. Uncle Drew tried to continue the tradition and named his firstborn son Philip, but his wife found out why and stopped him from sticking Charles with Bartholomew. Much to Charles's relief. Charles Lathe sounds awesome, high class, and blue collar at the same time. Bart Lathe sounds like a union organizer. I had asked Charles about his brother after I read his all-too-thin file, not wanting to ask Grunkle Drew about his suicide. As Charles put it, Philip had decided he wanted to end his pain rather than tell someone, anyone, about it and risk having them try to help him with it. If anyone talks about him at this get-together, it will be about his life, not his end. My grand-uncle James arrived in time for lunch in his own rental car along with his one daughter, Chloe, and her little boy, Peter. Unlike his brothers and one sister, most of James's hair was still a dark brown except at the sides. His eyes snapped to look at Grunkle's Drew-restored leg as soon as he arrived, but he didn't say a word. At least not at first. I think it was some sort of game between siblings, where despite his curiosity if he asked first, he lost. The adults sat inside with the air conditioning for old people talk, which I wanted to hear, but instead, I got sent outside with the kids. At least Paul got deemed a kid as well, although it was more likely he got sent out with us to supervise. Lunch was cold cuts, chicken, turkey, and beef only, on bakery hoagies, which were like bigger thicker hot dog buns. Chips, both potato and corn, veggies with dip, and potato salad. Just something simple to hold us over until dinner as far as my grandpa was concerned. Once we got the younger kids focused on eating, Paul had some questions. So, werewolves? I took another bite of my low-fat cheese and turkey sandwich with lettuce, tomato, and cucumber to thicken it up, and nodded. I admit, the little bit of horseradish Grunkle Drew managed to smear on my bread while Grandpa distracted me by stealing a carrot off my plate did add a nice contrasting sharpness to everything else in the sandwich. Not that I would ever admit it out loud. Paul gave me a dirty look as I slowly chewed. Ami however had to butt in. Yep, the whole town is filled with them, Grandpa dating one too. She's from Greece. I finished my bite as Paul asked Ami, is it something in the water around here? He gave the river a suspicious look. I cut Ami off. No, most of them were born that way. I've never gotten the full story, but they all gathered up here by word of mouth before America was even a country, then their kids all ended up marrying each other. We can try to get the story out of Nate when he comes in later, his family has been here forever. Chloe had wandered out the house by then to check on her son, and likely to get away from the older people. She was in an awkward position of being 20 years younger than the rest of her generation in the family, and at least 10 years older than the next. She was also the only adult outside to be able to show a reaction to my Grandma Brie and Aunt Rosaria when they step across from the edge of great-grandmother's land to Grandpa Lathe's. She nearly fell over as she began taking a few steps backwards in a near panic, before running to snatch up her son. Ami just looked up with a grin and wiggled out of her seat at the picnic table to begin running to meet them. Aaron also looked up and smiled a little before looking over with an astonished look to see Peter getting snatched up. A bit more surprise was seeing Erica look up and around before turning to look in the direction Ami was running off to with a wince. I only felt their arrival because Aunt Rosaria just used her raw strength to power through the spell to travel here, while Grandma Bree would take her time and do the spell in a way she called smooth, which made it undetectable, other than a deliberate signal to Grandpa's land sense to let him know she was waiting on the edge of his land for permission to cross over. Today she had an invite, so she just walked over, but normally Ami was out there waiting for Grandma Bree or Aunt Rosaria when they were due for her lessons to greet them and invite them onto Grandpa's land so that they never had to wait. Which meant Rosaria hadn't had the chance to be rude and walk in without an invite. Yet. I think she wanted to get into a fight with Grandpa Lathe, which meant everyone else wanted to prevent that. Aunt Rosaria liked to fight, Grandpa, well, as Grunkle Drew put it, John hates to fight, which is why he likes to make sure that if he has to fight, he only has to fight someone once. So, I plan to make sure that never happens, which is why I was rushing off to welcome Grandma and Aunt Rose. Grandma Bree had an old-looking wooden box in her arms with a picnic basket balanced on top, while Aunt Rose, predictably, was empty-handed. Ami ran up to them, took the basket off of the box, "Let me get that, Grandma," then turned around to hand it to me. I didn't mind, it had a sturdy handle that folded up from either side. From the smell of the basket, it most likely had a pie made from the fruit trees in great-grandmother's groves. Trees she had been selectively breeding for a few hundred years at this point. I had seen her make them walk once, to put them in better spots for access to sunlight. Not everything she did was scary, wicked witch stuff. Some of it was scary and wonderful witch stuff. My little sister then tried to pass the box over to Aunt Rosaria, who skipped past her to give me a side hug. "Happy birthday, Sarah." She slipped something into my back pocket. "I got you a debit card so you can buy whatever you want online, should be a few thousand on it." "Thanks, Aunt Rose. Do I want to know whose money it is?" She patted me on the head and got away with it because I had one hand filled with a basket handle. Someone who won't miss it, and deserved to lose it. Besides, I took a lot more from them and most of that went to people they owed for some of the stuff they pulled. A little extra for me and you is for my trouble. Grandma Bree finished hugging Ami from behind as the 11-year-old looked at me with a grin from behind the heavy box she could barely keep a grip on. I rolled my eyes but put the basket on the box and prepared to take the whole thing, but got wrapped up in Grandma Bree's hug first. As always, she smelled like wildflowers and autumn leaves, compared to Rosaria's wood smoke and cinnamon. Her hugs were also softer somehow, more like my mom's when I was a little girl rather than a little guarded like the ones I got now, from both my mom and my aunt. Ami surprised me by taking the basket rather than leaving it and the box for me to haul in. Grandma managed to help me pick the box up by the rope handles on either end before I could stop her. "So, you got me a dusty box?" She smiled at me with a glimmer in her eyes. "Your gift is wrapped up inside, along with your father's music books. It will give him something else he can share with his children other than learning how to fight people." I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Grunkle Drew had an upright piano in his barn that had belonged to great-grandmother Charity's family, which she had inherited despite neither her or her children ever learning how to play it. Grandpa Lathe had it nearly rebuilt after it had been sitting around in storage and guilt my dad into trying it out, then agreeing to put a nook in our practice room to house it. The solid black instrument was a Steinway, which meant it was actually worth something, but I think it meant far more to my dad, and that was something his father's family was entrusting to him. But I had hardly heard him do anything with it other than to play a brief tune while checking the keys to make sure they worked. It had sounded like he knew what he was doing. Why was that the first time I had ever heard of it? Peeking through the old slats that made up the lid of the box, I could see something wrapped up in a hand-knitted blanket, which would be part of the gift itself. Grandma Bree thought wrapping paper was wasteful. As we got back to the house, we could see Chloe clutching her son to her chest as she was being reassured by her father James and Grandpa Lathe, only to see her begin to shake as Grandma Bree and Aunt Rosaria both snapped their heads at her. Rosaria tensed up for a moment, then seemed to shake it off as she began to laugh. "Hey Johnny, it's official. It runs in your dad's family." Grandma Bree sighed at her and then gave Chloe an actual curtsy. I greet you as kin sister, our families are bound by blood and we are both here as guests. Endora's feud with your coven is not mine. Then she turned her head to give Aunt Roashria a long, dry look. My aunt sighed. Relax girlie, even if I did have an issue with your coven, which I don't since I consider some of them as almost friends, Johnny would get really angry with me if I went after his cousin. She looked at my dad, who nodded in response. I wasn't sure if that nod was to say yes, he would be mad, or yes, she's his cousin. It could be both. They had grown up with only each other around to play with, and only a month apart in age, so they had an almost weird twin thing going on sometimes. I walked over to shove my dad's box at him. Okay, nobody is going to fight and all the family that is coming is here, can I start opening gifts? I didn't. Instead, everyone, kids, adults, witches, and werewolves ended upstairs in the ballroom where I had been allowed to help the men set up some old wooden folding chairs for everyone to sit. Grunkle Drew waited until everyone had taken a seat. All right. He pulled up the short leg of his shorts and twisted his raised foot from side to side as he held it up in the air. In case anyone missed it, I lost my leg after some sores got infected and the doctors all said it had to come off. He set his foot on the ground. Then John bit me on the arm and turned me into a werewolf. Uncle James looked from his sister Lois to his younger brother Grandpa Lathe, then leaned back in his chair to look over at his daughter with a suspicious look. Drew continued. So of course most of you aren't going to believe that. I thought that unlike me and my son, no one here had ever dealt with the secret supernatural stuff. But it seems that Chloe had something going on. Everyone looked over at the only blonde person in the room, who slowly began to blush. Her father, Uncle James, reached over to her and began to rub the back of her neck where it met her shoulder. It's okay, whatever it is you don't have to talk about it. She shook her head and gave Aunt Rosaria a nervous look. Grandma Charity taught me before she passed. She said I was the only one in the family that was strong enough to learn without it just putting them in danger, and she taught me how to find others. That's how I met Samantha, and the rest of the coven. She looked over at Grunkle Drew and Grandpa Lathe. Are you really werewolves? I was told you were real, but you stayed out of the cities because of all the vampires? Uncle James's eyebrow had gone up, it looked like they may stay that way for a while. Grunkle glanced at his son Charles, before nodding. That's what I've been told. Then he looked around the room. So we're going to come back around to our mom being a witch later one, but right now, who wants to see an old guy turn into a wolf? Grunt Lois looked at her brother Grunkle Drew. Is it gross? She wiggled her hands around awkwardly. When you go wolf? He looked over at my grandpa who was sitting down staring off blankly in the general direction of one of the attic ballroom windows, as was my father, as until my mom reached over to take his hand and shake him a bit. Normally she just punched him in the shoulder when he went off like that, but I guess she wanted to make a good impression on her husband's extended family. When it was just Grandpa, she didn't bother to hold back anymore. Grunkle Drew shook his head. Well, I've only seen John do it. It was kind of like he was putting on a wolf-shaped coat and filling it out from there with a snap. It takes me a half a minute or so, and turning back too soon wipes me out for a few hours, as well as making me as hungry as a bear, so I'll let John show you. Grandpa Lathe's head snapped up. What? Oh, yeah. It doesn't hit me as hard, and no one wants to see Drew with no clothes on, even when he's covered in fur. He stood up and looked around at the family. So, this is the time to decide for yourselves, and for your kids. Seeing is believing. Do you want to see this, to know this? He waved his hand over at the stairway. You can head downstairs and pack up your bags. The keys for the rentals are by the front door, and we won't talk about any of this stuff around you whenever we get together again. This is when you decide if you want to look behind the curtain, or just stick to living in the world you know. Lois's husband stood up slowly, looked over at his wife with a smile, then around the room. I have no intention of walking away from the chance to hear about everything, but I wanted to stand up so anyone who did want to pass on this opportunity didn't hesitate just because they didn't want to be the first one. He looked around the room again. Anyone? No? Then he sat down while reaching over to take his wife's hand as she gave him a tolerant smile. My grandpa headed over to the hall closet to pull out a bathrobe. "Sarah, I'm going to borrow your room, okay, the half bath's a little tight." He closed the door to my room before I could respond. "Sure grandpa, it's your house. Just please don't shed on my bed." His responsive brat from behind the door could be clearly heard by everyone in the room. I looked around with a grin. It would only be a problem if he decided to lie down. He has to walk around in a circle 3 times first. Grandpa opened the door in his bathrobe with an ungrateful child. "Don't think you get to act up just because company is here." Walking out to the center of the room, the old man sort of dropped forward like he was going to do some push-ups, and landed on all 4 paws, shaking his way loose from the bathrobe. Wolves are not dogs. A German Shepherd weighs in at about 80 pounds, your average wolf is twice that weight and size. Grandpa has about 30 pounds on your average wolf as he stood there in his mostly light gray and white fur. So most of the family just froze in place, before Erica turned to her parents and squealed. "Can we keep him?" I had never seen a wolf give someone a dirty look before. But I didn't think for a moment it would be the last time. With a spring in his steps, Grandpa headed over and sat before his sister, before stretching his head forward to poke her bare leg below her knee with his nose. On reflex, Grunt Lois slapped his. "Stop that, your nose." Then she stopped and blinked as she realized she had just tried to slap a 180-point wolf on the snout. Then Grandpa's head snapped over to one side with his ears perked up, before he looked over at me and nodded his head off towards the direction of my room where his phone was chirping to signal that someone was at the front gate. Unlocking his phone with the simple up-down swipe showed me Nate's parents on the camera, so I pressed the button to open the gates. "Hi Mr. and Mrs. Evans. Everyone is upstairs for a family meet and greet, but I'll meet you downstairs." My guests had begun to arrive. While Grandpa's family would be meeting and talking to my mom, dad, sister, and brother all day, along with some of the local adults. I had invited a few people my own age to hang out and eat dinner, and I had also asked them to invite a few more people as well. I had got to meet a lot of people my age at the solstice party, but it had only been in passing. There had just been too many people to meet to get to know anyone. Now I would have time, which made me a little nervous. Dad had made a point of telling me he would not be doing up profiles for the people I would be going to school with for the next 5 years. I was going to be on my own for this. At least the first person to get here was Neil. He was a year older than me, and a natural-born werewolf, but he was nice. My dad liked to act like he was worried about me getting to know a teenage boy, but I think it was mainly an act. He sometimes acted like what he thought people were supposed to act like from watching TV shows and movies. Which I had been told was endlessly frustrating for my mom. He had been way too embarrassed to talk to girls like the guys in movies and just ended up talking to them like people. Which is what attracted Mom to him in the first place, since he didn't treat her like a girl to be flirted with or dismissed. But she was nearly as socially awkward as him and didn't know how to make a move either. Now that I was in any better of a position, but I was only 14, as of today, and I only had a couple of years of going to a normal other than all the werewolves, high school to develop my social skills after years of homeschooling. So until then, I was going to let the people I was going to get to know today take the lead since they knew what they were doing. As I headed out from the kitchen I could hear Mr. Evans asking Neil, "So isn't the daughter kind of young for you?" Only to hear Neil say, "Dayawad. She's just turning 14 today, she's like a little kid." As I came to stop at the top of the steps down from the veranda, Nate looked up to make eye contact with me and went pale. Mr. Evans shoved his son at me. "Better talk fast, son, and make it good." Neil opened his mouth but nothing came out as I walked down the steps and then over to him before crossing my arms and looking up at him with a scowl on my face. "Do you regret saying that?" He snapped his mouth shut and nodded. "That was just to get my parents to shut up, I didn't mean." He started to wave his hands around while he tried to find the right words, so I gave him a break and reached up to his forehead with my index finger held back by the thumb. He winced a little before I unleashed the finger of flicking, but he didn't try to avoid it. "Now say you're sorry and I'll forgive you so we can get on with our day." Then I'll only bring it up again every now and then whenever I want for as long as we know each other. That's fair, right? He blinked, then nodded. Right, sorry. Mr. and Mrs. Evans, can I borrow Neil for a while? I didn't get a chance to show him the house last time. Mrs. Shopkeeper waved us off. Go ahead, your grandfather showed us most of everything at the party. Make sure Neil gets to see the library. As I set off dragging Neil behind me, I could hear Mr. Evans say something about still not believing Grandpa had a Gatling gun. I made it all the way into the kitchen before I looked back at Neil only to see him looking awkward, and I realized that I had grabbed him by the hand and was still holding it. I let myself scream internally, but it wasn't like he was letting go. So after giving his hand a quick squeeze, I let it go to point around the kitchen. So the guy who was building this place originally wanted to call it Olympia, which is why we got people in stolas, I think they're called, all over the walls in here. The guy ran out of money before anyone got around to carving all the statues he was planning on, which is why we go stands for them all over the place with big planters on them. Neil brightened up and looked around the kitchen as he sniffed the air. Wow, your family really likes bacon. I rolled my eyes. My great-aunt's family is Jewish, so Grandpa went a little overboard on eating as much of the forbidden meat as he could fit in. My mom finally had to put her foot down. He grinned, then reached up to scratch himself in front of his ear. I'm not sure how, or if, I should ask this, but my grandma's really into genealogy and she was curious where your family comes from. He held his hands up almost defensively. Not just your mom, in fact she's mostly curious about your grandpa's people. She thinks they may have been werewolves that lost their wolfness from marrying regular people, and that's why he's so strong. I thought that over for a bit, holding up one finger for him to give me a moment. I don't mind if you ask about my family, even the Asian half, but if it starts to feel weird, I will mention it. I pulled out one of the kitchen island stools for him, then another one for me, and had a seat. My mom's family is one of the Ichiban families from Japan, but her mom, my grandmother on that side, married a Korean man, my grandfather, who runs a Korean restaurant. On my dad's side, well, it's my grandma Brie and her mom who came over from Europe back in the 1500s or something like that. She left behind some bad experiences that she and her daughters don't talk about, but it left her really hating men. I looked at Neil and his somewhat widened eyes. If you meet her, just try not to say anything. Or make eye contact. He turned his head to give me a side look as if he wasn't sure if I was serious or not. So I reached out and touched his hand again. I'm serious. My grandmother can manipulate reality to make my grandpa rich by having one of his weekly lotto tickets win, and my great-aunt throws fire around that's hot enough to melt steel, and both of them are afraid of their mother. I leaned back and crossed my arms to rub my upper arms to fight off the chill I always got when I let myself think too much about Endora Kane. It shouldn't be too much of an issue. I'm not strong enough to be a real witch, so she doesn't care enough about me to care about my friends or show up for my birthday. But if you even meet her, treat her like a bee. I looked up into Neil's wide open but still warm brown eyes. Don't piss her off and she won't go Old Testament on you. Wolfboy nodded. I'll keep that in mind. Then, since he hadn't teased me about grabbing him by the hand before, I reached out to him, without quite grabbing a hold of him. And he took my hand this time. Let's start on this floor so my dad doesn't hear our voices. We'll start with the library. As we headed down the hall, hand in hand, I missed what Neil had quietly asked the first time he asked it. Huh? He gave me a questioning look. I asked if your dad hated me or something. I giggled, a little too much really, but no, I think he's just acting like how a protective father is supposed to act. He learned most of his social skills from TV. That, and I think he enjoys bullying you. I'll make sure Aaron thanks you one day for letting out Dad get it out of his system before it was his turn. Before the family meeting broke up, I managed to show Neil the library, but not the secret room, to which he stood wide-eyed in amazement as he took in the exactly 144 individual weapons in the room, including the shiny brass work of the Gatling gun. I had found a dozen or so wooden practice weapons, some of which showed use, and some cheaper decorative things in a corner of the secret room rather than in with the rest of the collection, but I had deliberately never asked about them. Instead, I looked up the number 144, which is a measurement called 1 gross. The old man had set up the entire room in that exact number for some lame joke he had yet to make. And I was not going to be the one to let him get to make it. At least not until he was having a bad day and I thought he really needed a win. I managed to get as far as showing off the indoor pool with the topless mermaid statue pouring out water from what Grandpa's girlfriend told me was an amphora before I heard people begin making their way down the steps from the attic. Neil looked in that direction the same time I did, so I told him that looks like the wolf report is over. He did that cute head tilt thing I had noticed he did whenever he was confused. My grandpa decided to let his whole family in on the werewolf thing, and let them decide if they want to be one. His eyes went a little wide, then he looked thoughtful. That's not how we do things here, but then most of our families are all either werewolves or know about it even if they can't turn. Would all of your family be moving here, or trying to stay where they are? Vampires might be a problem for them if they live near a big city. Neil narrowed his eyes. A small city might even be worse. I've been told they get more territorial in smaller places. They don't feel safe unless they have enough of them around that they won't be singled out if someone comes after them. Well, that got my attention. Do you guys talk a lot about other people, like us? He scratched in front of his ear again. I guess I can talk about that. My granddad and a bunch of guys his age got recruited to fight in World War II. They keep running into vampires in France that were pretty mad about what they called cabots in their cities. At least until some of the younger ones very politely told them off for insulting the Americans who had come to fight for them. Granddad got to talk with a couple of them and found out the German vampires would be a lot less welcoming, but he never saw any of them but the time he got to Germany. He guessed they figured out how things would go them and cleared out. At that point, I heard little feet headed our way and looked over to see Aaron at the sliding glass door between the pool and the little room with the mini bar that stood between the men's and the women's changing room and had the door back into the main house. Dad said you have guests, so boy time is over. He seemed disappointed that boy time meant me and a boy talking alone quietly. I wave at Neil to follow me rather they grab him by the hand in front of my little brother. Dad had ways of making people talk, and he might have questions for Aaron about what me and Neil had been up to. Outside, the neighbors had arrived and Melinda rushed forward to shove what felt like a book wrapped up in shiny pink wrapping paper with purple ribbon and grabbed both of Aaron's hands before looking up to glare at Erica who had been walking over. Still glaring at the other little girl, she demanded, "Let's play, Aaron," before beginning to try to drag him off. Dare followed her over. Gently, Melinda. No roughhousing with. He looked around at all my family members he didn't know. Little kids. After tucking the wrapped up book under my arm. It's okay, they all got filled in on the wolf part. I don't know if they all believe, even after Grandpa turned into a wolf in front of them. But you don't have to worry about what they might overhear. I held the book up and wiggled it around a bit. And really, the bookstore owner got me a book for a present. Sort of one-stop shopping there. The older man smirked. That last year's yearbook. You can check out your young man's picture from back when he was a 7th grader, check out the club's photos, and find out what your teachers look like before you show up to school. He leaned over and held his over to one side of his mouth. I put a little black dot in the lower right corner of the pictures of the faculty who aren't human, so you know not to worry about seeing or overhearing anything. Then he pursed his lips. But then they don't have any clue what all you can do. I've seen you and your sister practicing outside every now and then when I had to hunt down Melinda, and I am not so disappointed that turning into a wolf is the only thing I can do. Oh, they're digging up the deer, talk to you later. I waved at him and turned to tell Neil I had to drop off my gift at the card table set aside for them when I realized he was looking at me with a surprised look. You can do magic? I thought you only did like Captain America stuff. I think I may have blushed, or at least my face felt hot. I'm not strong enough to do real spells and rituals, just little things like make light or snuff out a candle. I wasn't going to mention being able to set things on fire, that felt like it would lead to showing off, and that's how people's houses got burned down. I'm about as strong as someone can be and do Captain America, or inner magic. while my sister Ami is too strong to do inner magic at all. In fact, she's so strong she was doing magic at random until she trained all summer so she could go to school too. I gave him a questioning look, and if what I can do is Captain America stuff, what is it that you do? Neil stood up straight. Larry Talbot stuff, or at least Lon Chaney Jr. stuff. We werewolves have a long cinematic history. He grinned for a moment, then tried to look serious. So other than sneak around so I can't hear you, do first level spells, and talk about lifting 800 pounds like it was nothing, what all else can you do? I gave him a smile at him while I thought that over. Well, I guess I can tell you, but maybe some other time. I got guests. But let's just say a lot of things, but not necessarily all of them all that well. I'm still in training. He nodded after a moment. I'll take that as a promise, and I'm going to get some food. It's been almost 4 hours since I ate anything. I sighed as he headed off. I guess it wasn't just my grandpa that ate like that. Dare had squeezed Dell and their other sister Sheila into the back of his car along with Dell's friend Anna, although I think the only reason Anna came was to keep Dell company and because Grandpa has gotten a good reputation for feeding werewolves pretty well. Still, with 4 of us, we had enough for a game of volleyball even after Dare wandered off to look for food, and with only 2 people per side, we had enough room to move. Jumping high and wide to hit the ball. Despite being taller, Neil let me take the lead. I could jump higher than him, hit the ball, and also land on my feet. To be fair, while the boy wasn't graceful, he did have a move where he used his strength to literally throw himself off the ground to get back up. There were some kids there as well, but the 4 of us were it for teens for the moment, other than my cousin Pete who wandered over at some point. So I got a question. I nodded at him, go ahead and ask. He shook his head at me. No, for the werewolves, him specifically. He pointed at Neil. Dell looked annoyed. I'm as much of a werewolf as he is, ask me. Pete gave her an embarrassed look, then shrugged. My Uncle Drew grew his leg back after he got bit, does everything grow back? He looked around a bit, it's kind of important, at least for me. Dell looked confused. Well, we can try to answer you, but we were all born as werewolves, what are you worried about growing back? Pete huffed. Foreskin. The blonde leaned forward with her eyes wide. What's a foreskin? My cousin blushed, then Dell cracked up. Kidding. But I really don't know, you would have to ask Mr. Lathe, sorry, I think you got like 5 or so of those. She pointed at me. You would have to ask her grandfather or his brother, they're the only 2 werewolves I know of that became that way from being bit. Pete looked thoughtful, then shook his head. I'll give my grandfather time to ask, then bug him about it. I don't want those 2 mocking me about it every time I see them. Then he looked from Dell to Anna. Since you okay answering questions thought, and this is from an entirely scientific curiosity, what about hymens? Both of the other girls froze up for a second and then began to laugh. Anna fanned her fingers out as if brushing away any awkwardness. It might be different for a girl that got bit, but from what we get told, the sheriff checks to make sure our families don't lie or leave us in ignorance. They don't heal. She glanced around. And if you want the highlight of the rest of the sheriff's girl talk. We can't stay pregnant if we turn into a wolf every month, but we should still make the boys wear condoms, because we can still get sick. Just not as easily. And if we do want to have a child, wearing a silver earring with a real silver post will keep us from changing shape by accident. She pointed a finger at my cousin. Oh, and if a guy won't wait, he doesn't care about you, he's just tired of using his hand. Pete was blushing at this point, as the dark-skinned girl had stepped a little closer to him with each sentence and ended up poking him in the chest with her last words. So, you thinking of getting bit? I'm curious what that curly hair would look like as a wolf. She reached up for my cousin's thick head of curly hair, stopping just short of running her hand through it. Despite his embarrassment at how close she was standing next to him, my cousin stood his ground. I think he was 17, and Anna was only 15, but I was still impressed at how he wasn't blushing anymore, or backing away. He wasn't getting overconfident either. He cleared his throat. I was thinking about going to medical school before I make a decision, and probably finish my clinicals. Vampires were mentioned and I don't want any conflicts with them conflicting with my education. But I would love to hear your opinion on that, maybe while we went on a walk. Anna hesitated, blushed a little, and then took a step back. Maybe after dinner. I'm looking forward to getting to eat without having to fight my 3 brothers. She turned to give Dell a look, checked to see Pete still looking her way, then headed for where my dad was carving up the roasted deer. I nudged my cousin in the ribs. Really, the first thing you think of with a wolf girl is to take her for walkies? Pete gave me a worried look, while I grinned up at him. And those brothers are all probably werewolves too, you know. He blushed. If I'm able to become one of them, and decide to do so, I've been told I might live over 100 years, but any girl I meet might not be able to become one too. He glanced over at me. It might be best to plan for the long game. He followed the girls toward the food. I turned to ask Neil if he was ready to eat, only to find out he had vanished while I wasn't looking. After a moment, I spotted him at the buffet filling up a plate, in layers. I guess I'm not the only one who can sneak around, and I would always be in competition with food to keep a werewolf's attention. Maybe I should keep snacks on me. Unlike the last party, it was the younger people who got to sit at the dining room table with me, the birthday girl, while the older people sat outside and kept an eye on the little kids. In addition to Dell, Anna, and Neil, Pete made the cut for the big table as another teen. While Ami and Sheila, who had already bonded to the extent of whispering and gigging, filled up the table except for one empty spot. Grandpa offered to fill a plate for me so I wouldn't have to wait in line, but there weren't that many people. And I didn't trust him to choose my food for me. I did not want an all-meat and dessert plate. After eating, I headed back outside to open presents. The word had been passed around that I needed warmer clothing for the upcoming Michigan fall weather, or that my family would like plants and seeds as housewarming gifts to put into the little indoor greenhouse. The highlights of those were an apple tree sapling from Grunkle Drew that would have to be planted outside, and a red leather jacket from Uncle Mark, which his daughter confessed had been hers for the whole 2 months before she outgrew it, but it still looked amazing. My parents and other relatives mainly got me things like t-shirts, some gloves, hoodies, and a green knit hat with a matching scarf. While my parents got me socks and workout clothes, because they don't love me. Kidding, I wear out workout stuff pretty quickly, so they were just trying to be practical. My real gifts would be getting taught a new move or technique from each of them. Ami got me underwear. In front of the people from the school, I was going to have to see every day starting in a week, and the extended family I had just met. And she knew what she was doing as she stared me in the eye and grinned. Aaron got me a can of fake peanut brittle, which I opened in his direction to shoot 3 plastic-wrapped snakes at him, sending him running away and giggling like mad. Grandpa told me I would have to wait for the next time I visited the Ichiban family compound as he had gotten together with my Uncle Dan for my present. Which made me stare at him in suspicion. The last gift I unwrapped was a dark green hardbound blank book bound in leather from Grandma Bree, wrapped in a matching hand-knitted throw in the same brilliant shade of green and with a few dull yellow bands in one corner. The same pattern as the blue and black throw my grandpa kept on a bench in the solarium on one side of the kitchen. My grandmother smiled gently as I flipped through the book. They say that witches have a book of shadows with all their spells. And you are a witch, no matter how strong others might be. So you should have your book to keep notes in, both for your inner and outer magic. Some little girl like you can learn from it someday. The throw I knitted since John told me how his mother made one for each of her children, grandchildren, and their children before she passed, all except the ones she never got to know about. The yellow yard is from the material she bought but never used, and the pattern is the same. Your Uncle Drew kept her knitting basket and loaned it to me for your father and his children. It was the same colors as my eyes, the ones I got from a woman who I could have met if we had been given the chance. My dad handed me a handkerchief, which I have found myself in desperate need of, while my grandmother hugged me close. Happy birthday, our beloved. I got the hiccups before I got myself back under control, which made me laugh while I was crying and hiccuping. All of which should have made me even more embarrassed than opening a package of white panties from my sister in front of everyone. But most of my family seemed happy for me to have a moment of connection with someone all but the youngest children remembered, while even Dell's eyes looked a little wet. My mom snuck me in a hug while Grandpa declared it was time for cake, which he had of course gone overboard with. He called it a Neapolitan cake with chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla cake sitting together side by side on a plywood board covered in plastic, all covered in matching frosting and big green lettering saying "Happy Birthday Sarah" a total of 14 times, as he explained, so that everybody gets some of the green frosting. There were also 14 little yellow flowers set in green leaves scattered evenly around the thing, with the lettering curving about it. As I glared at my grandpa, Neil hesitantly admitted that they let me make the flowers. I had to throw the first 7 out because they didn't look right. Well, I wanted to throw them out but my dad ate them. I rolled my eyes, werewolves. But smiled. Neil looked aside as he admitted, your grandpa insisted on paying for the materials, but we made the cake as your gift. The rest of the night went by quicker than I wanted it to. I got to talk to people, try on my jacket, talk with at least some of my newly met family, and take a walk with Neil over to show him my new house. And Dell, and Anna, and Pete, so it's hardly like we wandered off alone, so there was no need for my dad to carry over the apple tree sapling 10 minutes after we got there. Then people had to get home, and the people staying pitched in to pack up the leftovers, which was mainly a quarter of the cake, and clean up. As people began to get ready to head to their rooms, Grandpa, Grandma Bree, Aunt Rosaria, and Sophia all turned to face the west. While the older people just looked concerned, Sophia began to shake. Oh God, do I have to meet her? Can I go hide in my room? Grandma Bree hugged the girl from the side. She respects your uncle enough to entrust her great-granddaughter under his protection. She will not harm his guests. Grucknell drew squared up beside Grandpa, with my dad at his father's other shoulder as my great-grandmother Endora Kane walked out of the darkness. All dressed in black, with her typical scowl on her face. My dad whispered, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Lord Vader has arrived. Grandpa almost managed to make contact with him as he tried to elbow his son. Quiet you. Welcome Miss Kane, I'm afraid you're late for dinner, but we still have plenty of cake and ice cream. Great Granny, something I would never dare to call her out loud, came to a stop and looked around at my assembled family, all facing off against her. I don't believe I will pass up some fresh-baked goods, even if they are covered with too much of the frosting. A beer would be welcome as well. Well, that was friendly, for her. She walked over and sat down at one of the tables, setting down a heavy satchel that had been hanging from her shoulder as she pointed at me and then at the opposite chair. The other 2 chairs at that table had vanished before she had even stepped out of the darkness. Sit, child. I sat. My daughters have told me you have done well within your limitations. I nodded, firmly, while looking the old woman in the eyes. I think I may have even seen a hint of approval. I'm afraid rituals would be so difficult to learn, that I should instead focus on what I can learn in what time I have for basic spells. It can give me an edge, and learning them has. I wiggled my hands in the air as I tried to find the right words. Inspired me with doing new things with internal magic. She nodded, then looked up as Grandpa set down a plate with a fork and small slices of all 3 flavors of the cake, with half of the frosting cut off the top. He also had one of the beers from the 6 packs he had only got out of the fridge late in the evening. This stuff is supposed to be a reproduction of a recipe from Egyptian times. I kind of liked it. He also had a can of Diet Orange soda from a local company called Fago that I had taken a liking to. Thought you might like something to do with your hands. Which was thoughtful of him, saying it out loud wasn't, but I still said, thank you. Great-grandmother took a bite of her cake and surprised me with a smile. Very nice, I shall have to attend all your birthdays, child. I sipped my drink while the old woman slowly finished her cake, savoring each bite between happy sips of her beer. The rest of the family either were quietly escorted away by the supernatural half or casually continued cleaning up the remains of the party. Grandpa even called out. Don't mind us, Mrs. Kane, you're welcome to stay as late as you want, we even got some more room if you want to stay the night. all of which got him a narrow-eyed stare before she firmly went back to finishing her cake, while all but ignoring me after her first comment. Setting her fork down on the now empty plate, she finished her farro ale and gave me a long look. I realize now that it may be a bit rude, but I thought that your weakness might put you in danger. But I believe that you will be more than strong enough in time to face most any danger you are likely to meet. She reached into her bag to pull out a large yawning black puppy with huge paws. It sniffed at her plate, then looked up at me with big reddish-brown eyes and began wagging its tail. I made this to protect you until you came into your strength, and as a partner if you do follow your father in his profession. Its power will grow with yours should you bind it to you. You are enough of a witch for a familiar, even if it would normally be weaker than that of a more typical witch, but it is something I made. Weakness will be entirely relative. She set the puppy on the table and it walked over to lick my face before I thought to stop it. Then she stood and adjusted her hat before turning to walk back into the darkness. Merry birthday, child of my child's child. May you have many more. I laughed as struggled to get good enough of a grip to both hold and hold back the pup. Thank you, great-grandmother Endora. She paused for a moment. I think that's the first time I called her by name, then vanished into the darkness. I looked the pup in his eyes and felt a connection. And a name. Saku. To bloom and the new moon. My mom began to complain that my great-grandma should have asked before she got me a pet, while Dad just remarked that it was too late. I had named it. I got my face licked again while they had me distracted. I woke up at the age of 14 for the first time with an oversized puppy leaping up and down on my bed, before throwing itself on top of me and squirming its way in under the sheet to lick my ear. Ugh. No, Saku, no kisses. Then she was off of me, off of the bed, and racing around the bedroom I was going to have to leave behind today. Of course, she was a girl dog. Great-grandmother did not trifle with males. I guess you need to go outside? Saku froze in place with her head twisted towards me, before leaping onto the bed again, then from one side to the other, leaping over me again and again while barking in little yips. I guess you do. Sweat shorts, t-shirt, and socks. Then I opened the door and leaned to the side as I took the hit from an excited puppy as it rammed her way past me in the door, rather to let it hurt itself running into a steady leg. The little gal felt even lighter than she looked as she bounced off of me, all bones and fur. She raced down the steps, around the bend, and then came back up to see what was taking me so long, giving me a single questioning stare and a woof, before racing down the steps again. I went over the railing to catch up with her, lightening myself a bit so I didn't wake anyone up by slamming down on the steps with a thud. On the next step down, I could smell sausages cooking in the kitchen down below. Werewolves. The sun is hardly up and they're already getting something ready to eat. Downstairs I could hear claws tapping on linoleum, and my grandfather and grunkle trying to hype my puppy up so much she was going to have an accident. By the time I got into the kitchen though, Saku had gone silent as I saw my grandpa tossing her bits of a bratwurst sausage to her. Grandpa, no. People food is bad for dogs, and what you eat is even worse for her. He grinned at me and tossed the last bit of the sausage in his mouth, before chewing it up. My grunkle Drew laughed and turned to me. He headed out around 2 in the morning to get your dog a collar and a leash, as well as some puppy chow. He's just spoiling his grandpup. So that left me standing there feeling both annoyed and grateful, but I settled on annoyed as my puppy barked for more sausage. When I turned to chew him out, he held up his hands in surrender. They're all beef, low sodium too. I got a guy in the butcher's department at Red Smart. He pointed over to the wrought iron lounge chair in the sunroom with a bright green and black nylon leash coiled up on the seat. They had a machine for the tag. I put the sheriff's office for the address and phone number. Hope I spelled the name right. I checked and called Saku over to put the collar on the overexcited squirming pup. Yep, you spelled it right. I also checked the address but didn't ask why. I don't think having someone use my dog to find out where I lived was much of a danger. But the old man was still worried about protecting me and my family, even if he often didn't know how exactly to go about doing so. but sending anyone trying to track me down to his law enforcement super werewolf girlfriend who had nearly 100 other werewolves, many of whom were heavily armed, on call was a good start. So out the door, I went for nearly a half hour of being dragged along by a little black doggie who wanted to sniff at everything before she finally peed just a little in nearly a dozen different places before racing me back to the house. I was going to have to learn how to train her because I was not going to be doing that every morning. It would cut into my morning run time. Back in the kitchen, I had my parents, Grandma Bree, and a sleepy Ami and Aaron waiting for me. My dad hefted Ami up into his arms despite her age and headed out the door I had just opened. We got some business at our new home before we move in. The others shuffled out the door as well. Only Grandma Bree explaining that, it time to set the final wards. Once those are set, even I would be weakened if I entered without an invitation or with ill intent. She had done most of the work before the foundations had even been set, even having Ami and me bury the stones we had copied the symbols from her tablet onto as one of her lessons. 3 of the same blood, which is all, will make for a strong ward that will only grow in strength throughout the generations. Even if the house passes into the hands of others, it will still protect those who make this their home. Today was a lot simpler. Mom passed around some envelopes containing hair from our last haircuts. We had planned on doing this in a metal bucket on the back deck at home when Ami started showing her power, but a fireplace is supposed to be even better. Grandma made a tisk sound at her. It's a hearth, even if you never cook on it. Your stove or John's barbecue would have been a better choice than a bucket. My mom narrowed her eyes. I'm not burning hair where I cook, never mind. From what I had learned so far, blood would have been better than hair, even just 3 drops. But my grandmother knew better than to start a fight that wasn't worth winning. Besides, her next lesson would probably be how to upgrade the wards with our own blood when we could do so without the parents ever knowing. At least Aunt Rosaria wasn't setting the wards. She probably would have just stabbed everyone with some magical flying needles and claimed we were being babies if we complained. After that, we got to eat with the entire family, split up with the adults in the dining room, and the kids either at the breakfast bar or outside on the patio. No sucka, no begging. Aaron, stop feeding her, I don't want her to learn to beg. My little brother was fascinated with my dog, staring at her with wide eyes. He wasn't trying to pet her at all, only slipping her a little bit of food while grinning at her with the same smile he got while playing with his toys. After we finished eating, I found out why my grandfather had us to wait to move into our new home. Evil old man. Okay, so maybe it didn't come as much of a surprise to them. All of them had volunteered when it was mentioned to them that we were moving into the new house the next day. Besides, between my parents, my grandfather, my grunkle, and me all having enhanced strength, it was hardly like anyone else had to do any heavy lifting. The new house was done in what I learned was called the Tudor style, which meant it looked about halfway between a cottage and a castle. It was far from the standard suburban house we had lived in with large but plain rooms. While discussing what they were going to build, with my grandfather pushing for something fancy, it was the tower, even a short stubby-looking tower, that woke up my mom's inner Disney princess. Her eyes sort of glazed over. A tower. The tunnel only went 80 feet. Also, to appeal to her inner cheapskate, Grandpa offered to pass down some of the old furniture from his house that had been passed down from his parents, and even his grandparents. That appealed to my mom, not only because no money was involved, but family ties were important to her. Which meant I got to keep the fake brass bed, the creaky hand-carved wardrobe, and the beat-up red velvet couch from the attic room at Grandpa's. All of which I loved. The bed had been Grunt Lois's when she had been a little girl, the wardrobe had belonged to my great-grandmother of the green and yellow eyes, and the hideous but super comfortable red couch had been passed, and sometimes forced from family member to family member. No one was sure anymore who had owned it in the first place. I was also up in the attic again in this house. What had originally been planned to be a storage room or emergency guest room up there had instead been claimed by me and Ami. Ami because she wanted to have the upper floor of the tower as her study room. Mom and Dad's room had the tower room on the second floor. While I had just gotten used to having a sloped ceiling and a flight of stairs between me and my parents. Ever since I had demanded to learn how to fight, they had been playing pranks on me in a game of what they called Kato and the Inspector on me. Now they had warned Ami that she got to play by making wards to warn her when they had broken into or were sneaking up to her room. A flight of stairs was going to benefit both of us. Aaron got stuck on the second floor with the parents and what was now the 2 guest rooms. Despite only being a quarter of a mile away from Grandpa's house, we still ended up loading everything in all of the various vehicles and taking 3 trips to get everything over there. With cousins Charles and Pete heading out to pick up pizzas for lunch. After which everyone left us to settle in until dinner. We ended up all standing in our kitchen where our mom was making a list of things she needed to pick up so she could start preparing all of our meals again. My dad was idly picking at the topping embedded in the melted cheese in the pizza boxes. About the only thing that was left was half a hamburger and veggie pizza that had been ordered for the Jewish side of the family, of which only Grunt Lois's husband and her husband had been the only ones to limit themselves to. It seemed that their children and grandchildren were fine with pepperoni. Pete had explained. We tried to avoid pork, but it's pizza. You got to have pepperoni. Ami finished off her soda and raced out of the kitchen. I'm going to set up my room. My dad nodded at her with a grin, but looked a little sad, then her drifted over to hug Mom from behind, as she clutched at his arms. I straightened up in my chair. Are you two okay? My mom turned to look at me, her eyes looked a little wet. It's okay, Sarah. It's just hitting me that we can never go back to our home. The house we bought for our family is gone forever, along with everything else we ever owned, and this place is going to take a while to feel like home. I looked down at the table. Would it help if I made a mess, dropped something on the carpeting that would make a stain that will never come out? That got Mom to laugh and shake a fist at me. You better not. Saku had finished off the puppy chow that had been put in the clear mixing bowl for her to eat to keep her from begging. Of course, she hadn't touched it until everyone was done with pizza. So my puppy happily followed me up 2 flights of steps before proceeding to consistently hinder all of my efforts to set up my room. Pulling at my sheets when I tried to make the bed, then jumping on it when I tried to spread out the blanket. Digging into the boxes of my clothes as I tried to unpack them, and running off with one of my shoes. I finally had to stop and play with her for a solid 10 minutes before she started to get tired out and just laid down to watch me with an occasional tail wag when I looked over at her. My room had about a 5-foot wide flat 7-foot ceiling painted white and made with a bumpy surface, which I was told was called popcorning. It had a light fixture with a fan in the middle. Then the ceiling sloped down to about 4 feet on each side, with dormer windows large enough to climb out of on either side. I had another set of 3 windows on a 3-sided extension on the outer wall of the house with a padded bench seat built into it that flipped up for storage. The short walls also had slide-out drawers and bins, all of which along with the wall had been painted a pale green, with a dark green paint on the frame around the bedroom doors and the bits on the bottom of the walls. In addition to the wardrobe, I had a decent-sized closet over the top of the landing on the floor below. The floor was hardwood with a clear stain, but it was dominated by a huge dark green area rug with a pale green pattern running around the edge. Ami meanwhile got a tower room with windows all around it coming off the corner of her bedroom and even had a tiny little fireplace that she was forbidden to use until she was 14 and had at least one parent in the house and informed that she was using it. But I liked my room, and after I had packed away or placed all my stuff, I headed downstairs to help Aaron, then my parents. We had everything about halfway done when it was time to walk over to Grandpa's for the last supper before people had to start heading home on Sunday. Tonight we were going to find out what everyone had decided as far as becoming a werewolf or staying baseline human. I hadn't shared that term yet with anyone, but I figured it was better than normal human, muggle-tea or great-grandmother's term, mere mortal. Grandma Bree had figured out how to measure someone's innate magic, at least well enough to figure out if they were anywhere near the level needed for the werewolf curse to take a hold of them rather than just leave them with a bite wound they would need to wash out and apply some antibiotics to. It turns out that a normal human bite is pretty nasty and prone to becoming infected. This time we had gathered up in the living room. It was a little crowded with everyone in there, but it was a much more friendly feeling room, a place for family rather than revealing the mysteries of the world. My great-uncle-in-law, which I don't really have an abbreviation for, stood up first. He looked down at his wife Grunt Lois as she took his hand and stood up beside him. They exchanged a look before he looked at their children. I am officially the least magical person in the room. And since I didn't even know magic was real before yesterday, I can't say I'm too upset about it. I've lost nothing. Yesterday I had the love and respect of my wife, my children, and my grandchildren. I still have that today. I could ask for nothing more, other than for this stubborn woman to take the chance to have decades together with her family. He gave Grunt Lois a stern look that was spoiled as he fought back some tears. His wife looked up at him with much of the same expression. I told you. I can stand outliving you by a few years. I won't do decades without you. She looked out at her children and her brothers. I could be one of them, even a strong one. But I choose a mortal life. Then she smiled. Arwen's choice, and I used to think she was an idiot. Grunkle Drew closed his eyes and nodded, while Grandpa turned away and walked out of the room. Got it. Your choice. I just need a minute. I gave my parent a look as I stood up, and got a nod from my dad. Ami hesitated, then jumped up to follow me. We found him outside, standing out on the dock and looking out at the sun sitting up above the trees on the other side of the lake. This time I hesitated while Ami slipped past me to wrap herself around one of his arms. It's okay, Grandpa. Don't jump. He snorted and I grabbed a hold of his other arm. After a moment I demanded. Talk to us. After looking down at me, then my sister, he looked out again. My mother had magic. Not a lot. She told Sophia that she would be stronger than her when she came into her power, but she did have some. And she never told us. None of us were strong enough to learn the only sort of magic she knew of, but she could have shared it with us. It might have been different. My mother having magic might have been enough for your grandmother not to fear letting into her life as her son's father. It might have been enough for her mother to let me be part of her family. I could have held my son as a child, seen him grow up, and be there when my grandchildren came into this world. Now I got magic, and I've tried to share it. And my sister doesn't want it. I'm going to live to see my older sister die, to watch as old age takes her bit by bit, and then go on for years knowing she didn't have to. That things might have been different. He stiffened up. But another woman I love is choosing to cut me out of their life. Crap, is that why it hit me so hard? I squeezed his arm tighter and tried to pull myself in close to him. Ami stepped back and kicked him. Stop it. It's not everyone. You're always going to be our grandpa. She will always be your sister and your mom is always going to be your mom. What they chose wasn't about you. Then she stepped back again for another kick and almost fell off the dock before Grandpa snagged her by the shoulders. I had to let go of him for him to get to her in time. I almost didn't. Seeing Ami go into the river in her nice clothes might have cheered the old guy up. Grandpa pulled her into a hug. It's okay, little girl. I just had this dream of all my brothers and sisters coming here when they got too old to pass for normal humans anymore. Of being a family, all together in the same house again. He laughed. We'd kill each other within a month. But it still hit hard, not being able to share something with them. To finally be the one to help the rest of them, rather than be the little brother they all worried about. Turning around, he pushed at our backs to get us moving. Time to find out what happened with everyone else. My dad met us at the door to the kitchen. Arlo could turn, but his wife can't, so they decided he would stay human. Macy can turn, but her husband is iffy, but he wants her to turn since she's had some fertility issues. They went off to talk. He led us back to the living room while he talked. Pete is thinking it over. Mainly he wants to finish growing up before he slows down his aging, and the school he is planning on going to is in Boston, where vampires might be an issue. Grandpa nodded at my dad and then headed over to hug his sister. Sorry, Lois, just my abandonment issues kicked in. Go ahead and die like a measly human. She smacked him but did return his hug. Erica was talking excitedly with my grandmother, while her parents listened in. My dad nodded over at her. My mom thinks she might get strong enough to make a decent witch, and if Ami is willing to share some of the Ichiban inheritance with her, a versatile one. But being a werewolf as a backup plan if she peaks early seems to sound pretty good to her too. I looked over at the happy little girl and was not exactly jealous. I loved being able to do things, to jump, and run. To hit things really hard. To be a real-life action hero. But it did sting a little that magic had once again passed me by to make some other little girl a magical princess instead of a battle one. I shrugged it off. Pete's going to be Dr. Werewolf, Ami and Erica got the spells handled, and I'm the damage per second build. We just need Aaron to be the meat shield and my generation of the family is all set. My little brother turned around and peeped at me over the back of the couch before slowly shaking his head. I grinned at him. He'd grow into it. My great-uncle Mark wasn't sure about the werewolf thing, but the health benefits and living longer made him say it might be worth moving out of Hollywood, but Grandma Bree told him she could give his daughter Sophia a formula for a lotion that would conceal him from the vampires in LA, at least if he didn't change shape in front of them. Sophia of course did not choose to become a werewolf, in fact, she couldn't, and neither could I. We were both too far along in training as well as too strong to let a curse dig into us and take over our magic. Which was just as well as neither of the two werewolves in the room would have been willing to bite their niece. Although they were both more than happy to bite their brother. My grunkle Mark gave them both a sour look. Thank brothers, I'm really feeling the love here. Grunkle Drew shrugged. All I'm saying is with all the time you spend in Hollywood, getting chased by a couple of wolves in the dark before getting taken down and savaged is the real Hollywood werewolf experience. I don't want you to miss out, you only get bit once. Grandpa laughed, then waved at his brother to follow him. Let's go to the changing room for some privacy. I got a first aid kit in there anyways. Then he stopped and grinned. Changing room, didn't even think of it that way. About 5 minutes later they returned, Grunkle Mark glaring at his younger brother and smoothing down the surgical tape holding the gauze pad on his arm. I'm pretty sure you didn't need to shake my arm after you bite it. My grandpa just grinned. Just wanted to make sure it took, I don't want to do this twice. My grunkle Drew finally agreed to bite Sally and her husband in return for being promised to be named godfather if they did end up finally being able to have a child together. It wouldn't be until the full moon before anyone could tell for sure if the curse took or faded away. Before I got sent back home to start my first night of going to bed by 11 to get ready for school, I took the time to make a call. This is Adora, what do you need, Sarah? I hesitated. I just realized this could be an awkward call since my grandpa's whole family is here and he didn't invite you to meet them. She laughed. It is all right, child, I was invited to lunch Sunday before everyone began to leave. Now what is it that you need? I took a deep breath. Some of the family could become one of you, but choose not to, and it hit Grandpa pretty hard. I won't say who since it's their business, but he may need you tonight, even if you just stop by for a little bit. I heard her chuckle, so now you are setting up a booty call for your grandpa, it's nice to know how much you have accepted me. Nope, not having this conversation. Okay, thanks, goodbye. Then hanging up before she could say anything else. What is it with old people? Even my grandparents on my mom's side were all inappropriate in front of children and they had been married forever. I played some video games with Pete before we turned the controller over to the younger kids and then broke out a board game with Sophia and Charles. But the sun was barely down before it was time for Aaron to go to bed and I got stuck taking him back home since Ami was staying over for a sleepover with Erica. Saku met us halfway home, somehow having gotten out of the house. With one end of the leash that I had hung up on a coat hook in his mouth. The doors to the house had not only been locked and checked by both of my parents, but the alarms had been set. My dog and I could feel the connection to her, so I knew she wasn't something else in that form, dropped the leash and barked at me while wagging her tail. Great-grandmother said she made you. You're more than just a dog, aren't you? She tilted her head at me and made a little questioning sound. Aaron slipped out of my hand to go over and set his hand flat above Saku's head before awkwardly patting her 3 times, then he looked over at me. Holding his hands apart and waving them up and down, he told me. Werewolf. Then brought his hands nearly together. People. Then he walked around behind the puppy, with her turning her head to watch him while making the little sounds she made when she wanted to play. He held his hands to either side of her, magic, before closing his hands to either side of my dog's head. Doggy. With a final, stern nod at me, he held his hand up for me to take. Home. I blinked, not really getting what it was he was trying to explain, then shrugged. I didn't think great-grandmother would make anything to hurt me or anyone else in our family. Well, I guess that settled that. After hooking the leash to my dog, I took Aaron home. Ran him a bath and then put him to bed. After he was settled in, I carefully checked the entire house to try to figure out how Saku had gotten out as she followed me around, jumping up and poking me in the legs, before playing with her until she got tired enough to settle down by me on my bed while I watched a show on my phone until I got tired enough to check on my peacefully sleeping brother and go to bed. About an hour later I heard my parents come in, waking up just long enough to see Saku with her ears perked up to listen, before she turned her head to me, nodded, and went back to sleep. I still hadn't seen her do her business on our walks, which meant either great-grandmother made her so she didn't need to, which I didn't believe the way the pup put away her puppy chow, or she was leaving to take care of things outside and then letting herself back in afterwards. As I drifted off that night, I decided a magical housebroken dog that let itself in and out wasn't a bad deal. Grunkle Mark's and Cousin Macy's bite marks had healed up by the following morning, while Macy's husband's wound was still there. It wasn't a definite sign that the curse had failed to infect him. And once Macy had become a werewolf, she could try to bite him again on the night of a full moon in the shape of a wolf, which might increase his chances. He had shrugged off the attempts to reassure him at breakfast. Worst comes to worst, I get a forever healthy wife that stays young while I get old. That's not a terrible deal. His wife threw a biscuit at him. Grunkle Drew caught it before it the ground when Rick dodged it, then he ate it while giving his niece a dirty look. I made these for my family with all my love, don't use it to try to hurt people. Shame, shame Macy. She flipped him off. I liked the women on my dad's side of the family. They're ornery. Me, Ami, and my mom had made a game of making it a point to immediately look up some of the old-timey words the old man used and then read them out loud. Ornery, bad-tempered and combative. Or stubborn. Grandpa complained we were ganging up on him and he looked to my dad for support. Dad just shook his head. Choose your battles to win the war. Then Mom tried to poke him in the ribs. You lost the war a long time ago, Gaijin Baka. The last day of the family get-together involved the little kids, which today meant that Ami had decided to go running around with the little girl next door, Melinda. While the older people sat around sipping drinks and talking about old times. To which I didn't have much to add, but I wanted to hear about the lives of these people who were now my family, including the ones that weren't around anymore. Just because I would never meet them, didn't make them any less my own. The sheriff arrived in time to help make lunch, this time stepping out of her patrol car in a sundress she had changed into before taking her long lunch break. I had seen her bike parked out by the garage when I went for my morning run, so she had come over the night before. I had also noticed Saku, who had shown up to run along with me that morning, despite me leaving her inside a locked door that morning. She disappeared into the woods now and then as I ran, only to reappear ahead of me to run along for a while before disappearing again. Teleportating pet dog. Yep. That's a thing now. I had been talking with Grunt Lois when Adora sat down with us. John, my John, didn't ask me to talk to you about this, but I had been married before. My Grunt gave her a guarded look. My Abe was a werewolf as well, but not as strong as me. We married back in 1946 and I watched him grow old faster than me for 57 years before I lost him. She looked off in the distance. I am me, and you are you. I had more time with Abe than most people have with their beloved, and I will see more years without him. But I at least have never regretted seeing each new day. Looking back to my Grunt, she said again. But as I said, I am me, and you are you. So now let us share embarrassing stories about your brother. Old women are evil. I would not want to hear the details of my brother's romance, while Grunt Lois openly laughed about what Adora had to share. Which drew over my mom and my grandmother. Soon I had to flee, getting clear just in time to look up and see my grandpa's and dad's worried looks. I looked them each in the eye, each in turn, and nodded. Yes, it is exactly as bad as you were worried about. I rode to the airport along with everyone else in the family, to see everyone off. There were a lot of hugs, which took me and my dad by surprise, along with exchanges of phone numbers, emails, and other social media contact information. It varies by the age of the relative. I even got some mailing addresses. There had also been a lot of photos all weekend, but we still took some more before anyone left. There was no guarantee we would all be able to get together in one place at one time again, despite Grandpa's attempt to get people to commit to Thanksgiving and Christmas. His nieces and nephews had in-laws that wanted family over for holidays as well. I could see him nearly offer to fly them out too, but Adora took his hand and gave him a look. One that was both affectionate and a warning. I'm starting to warm up to her. Then they were gone. Mostly. Grunkle Drew was staying one more night, as was his son Charles. So was my cousin Sophia with her little boy, and Grandma Bree. The last 2 weeks before school started up was Grandpa Bree's turn to teach Ami and me, and she offered Sophia the chance to sit in. Which made my cousin freeze up before her dad offered to take her son back home with him, and she nearly fell over herself thanking my grandma for the chance to learn, while Aaron hugged Peter and said, "Stay." It looked like they had bonded, plus Aaron wanted to play with a boy for a change. Not that it kept Melinda away. I had always known that great-grandmother Endora was a famous, or notorious witch as far as supernatural circles went, but I had never thought of Grandma Bree as someone well known. However, I had always suspected that Aunt Rosaria was well known, or at least most people had been warned. Before I went to bed that night, I decided to ask my parents about it. To my surprise, my mom spoke up first. She's the one everyone trusts. My side of the family has hired her to put up and renew the wards at the Enclave every 10 years. I even played once with her little red-headed boy once when she brought him along. He gave my dad a sideways look. The little brat thought me and everyone else in my family knew Kung Fu just because we're Asian. My dad fell back on their bed with a groan. I know Kung Fu is Chinese, now. But I knew your family did some kind of martial arts. You had training stuff just like in the movies all over the place. She flicked the end of his big toe. Uncle Dave bought all that stuff because he watched the same moves as you did. He gave her a resigned look, then sat up to answer my question. Mom was kind of the go-between for anyone who had to deal with Endora but didn't want to get near the old bat. She got to know everyone and often tried to help them out when they had problems. People learned to trust her, and she became the one everyone wanted to help them as the go-between when they had to deal with each other. Standing up, he began herding me toward their bedroom door. It actually helped me a lot when I began doing courier work being her son. He grimaced. And Endora's grandson. Just before he closed the door on me, he mentioned, "It may not hurt to work for her after you graduate, even if it's just for the summer. You can make a lot of contacts and get your name out there. Especially to hammer in the idea that you're Brianna Kane's granddaughter rather than just my kid." Then I headed up to bed, very glad the house was built with more than adequate soundproofing. And that I could turn off my enhanced hearing. Growing up in a regular house had been awkward when I complained in front of Grandma that I could hear my parents grunting and groaning as they trained at fighting without me after I had gone to bed. Grandma Bree had put up some soundproofing wards around their bedroom after she got done snickering and caught her breath. When I was out running the next day, I caught part of a conversation between Grunkle Drew and Grandpa. They saw me walk up, so I didn't think it was a private conversation. Grunkle Drew scratched at his head. "I was thinking about looking for a house around here, but I don't want you to throw money at me, so it depends on how much I can get for the old place." Grandpa fake sniffled like he was close to tears. "Ah, you want to live close to your little brother." Then he tried to go in for a hug, and they struggled for a bit before Grickledrew clutched at his leg and set out in a sharp tone which made Grandpa jump back with a worried look until Grunkledrew started chuckling. Chuckle, to laugh inwardly or quietly. Also, a continuous gentle sound resembling suppressed mirth. Grandpa shook his head at him while I patted him on the shoulder with a look of pity. That wasn't even the leg he was missing, Grandpa. Are you having a senior moment? I got a dark look as he planned something in retaliation. Grundledrew saved me. You're partially right. I wanted to keep the house in the family, but it's too big for me, and I don't think Charles is going to have kids. He's going vampire so he can be with his girl. Grandpa took in a deep breath before letting it out slowly. That's going to make family get-togethers a bit awkward. Vampires and werewolves can't be around each other, not safely. His brother leaned back against his truck and stared off into the distance. I got all this time left to live now. And in just a few years, there's going to be a day that I see my son for the last time. Again. I twitched. This was not a conversation I should be a part of. His older son, Philip, had killed himself as a teen. He hadn't been all that much older than me. Grandpa gave me a sad smile. It's okay, Sarah, go ahead and finish your run. Grunkledrew looked up from a memory and nodded to me. And your little dog too. I dashed over and hugged him tight. Love you, Grunkledrew. Then I got out of there before I started crying and made an old man cry too. Saku stuck pretty close to me for the rest of my run. How can I both mourn and be angry with a boy I've never met? My last 2 weeks of vacation involved a lot of magic lessons from Grandma that meandered even more so than normal, with Sophia asking questions that were beyond me and Ami. Then I would have to go and steal my puppy back from Aaron, Peter, and Melinda. And then my evenings were free for worrying about going to high school. Meander was another Grandpa word I decided to start using. It meant to wander aimlessly or casually without an urgent destination. Not the best way to teach if you wanted to learn, but it was more fun that way. I did take the chance to talk to Grandma about working with her for the summer after I graduated. With people who are long-lived, you got to give them time to get used to ideas. Grandma seemed pretty happy at the idea, which got me a jealous look from Sophia. She apologized later. I'm sorry, it's just that I would have loved the opportunity to work with Brianna Kane when I was younger, or even now. But I got a little boy I want to be there for as he grows up. She gave me an evil grin. So even though I'm so jealous that I hate your guts with every fiber of my being, I shouldn't try to make you feel bad. Then I got to talk to her about her high school years and found out she had done the same thing with making things fly around as a young witch, even if it wasn't as much as Ami, and she hadn't started until she was 15, which was more typical for the average witch. She shook her head at me. Your family is insanely powerful, Sarah. It's going to be like being part of a rich family, which you also are. People will want to get to know you to get closer to your sister or your grandma, she shuddered. Or for intervention from your aunt or great-grandmother. I knew some people like that because my dad is not so much of a Hollywood big shot as an average shot. But some people tried to work me. She nodded grimly. Watch yourself. On the first day of school, I ran and did a lightweight, 200 pounds, high-repetition workout with Grandpa's weight set. The old man puttered in and played with Saku using a knotted rope while I finished up. Puttered, from Grandpa again. To move or go in a casual, unhurried way. I wish I had something like a pen that had gotten passed down in the family to give you, or some sort of meaningful present. But your mom thinks I'm spoiling you every time I buy something for you. I sat up from the weight bench and wiped away the little bit of sweat I had worked up, then hesitated. I wish I could say how much I care about you without you having to turn it into some joke or try to mess up my hair. He grinned without looking up. I've been trying to have this conversation with you all summer, Grandpa. And now when I get the chance, I'm all over the place in my head about going to high school, feeling like I'm going to be the weird Asian girl in an all-white school, and not being a werewolf while so many of them are, and I can't do the magic that I should be able to do, and... I stood up and began pacing as I talked faster and faster. Throwing my hands out more and more with each step, until Grandpa moved quicker than I had ever seen him move before as he stepped up in front of me and flicked me in the forehead with the finger of flicking. Glaring up at him as he stood there with a warm smile on his face, I caught my breath. Then growled at him. What was that for? He pointed over at Saku. You were scaring the dog. My pup looked back and forth at us from where she had been comfortably curled up on one of the old mats in the corner and tilted her head to the side. She is not. Grandpa nodded. Okay, you were scaring me. You're all wound up and all I know is that this is something that a hug won't help. So I flicked you with the finger of flicking. I want to help, but I don't know if I can. What do you need? I took a deep breath. I need someone to fight. John Lathe, my dear beloved grandfather, who had managed to deal with a vampire out for his blood without the use of violence, tried to punch my head off. Then he got me by the t-shirt as I turned my head to the side and tried to put his knee in my stomach. I pushed his knee aside and grabbed his arm as I twisted it around to weaken his grip as I tried to push him back with my foot hooked behind his ankle. He jumped, and I heard something crackle high up in the shoulder of the arm I had gotten a hold of. I jumped back with a gasp, both hands over my mouth as my grandpa took a step back and looked down at his shoulder, which was hanging part way out of the socket. He shook it a little and it pulled up with a pop all on its own as he grimaced in pain. Then he looked at me with his eyebrows up high. Did that help? I started slapping at him, completely without any technique. Don't ever do anything like that again, old man. What the hell were you thinking? He just let me hit him until the damn tears started, then he patted me on the shoulder. There. Let it out. You might want to work on fighting people that can heal that fast, we got our own way of getting free from holds. I kicked him in the leg. I don't need you to help me that way. I got both of my parents for that. Just be you. He nodded and let his shoulder sag down. Good, because that hurt. Now you should go shower and get something to eat. Being hungry is only going to make being nervous worse. Then he sat down on the weight bench. I'm going to get in a workout, although the bars are lighter than I'm used to, there's one less plate on it. That's the first time I ever flipped off my grandpa. I will not explain why, or give him the satisfaction of asking how long he had waiting to use that. Back at my house, I got into the shower while my dad was waking up Ami for the second time. I got dressed, set the table for breakfast, and poured the orange juice before I ate with my family. Then I headed out to wait for the bus, with both my parents standing by me. Dad, Mom. They both looked at me. I don't know for sure, but I think having my mommy and daddy standing by me when we get picked up by the bus is going to make me uncool for all of high school. Ami nodded in agreement. My mom shook her head. I am not sending my little boy off to his first day of school while watching from the house. Go stand over there by yourself if you want to pretend to not be related to the only other Asian people in this town. Ami followed me over and grinned. Do you think we can pull it off? I grunted in a way that showed a tolerated appreciation of her joke according to my notes on Manspeak. You know Dad is going to do something, right? I grunted to show my acknowledgement and awareness as I glared at my father, who was deliberately looking off into the distance. I whispered, don't. I could hear a motor coming. He grinned. I glared, don't. He cleared his throat as an old yellow school bus turned the corner and pulled to a stop. A stop sign on the side of the bus rotated out with a squeal, and the door folded open. I rushed to get on the bus, with Ami close behind me. Mom gave Aaron one last hug and made a few unnecessary adjustments to his clothes before standing up with tears in her eyes as she looked me in the eyes and whispered, "Get them, John." My father began waving his hand in a large arc over his head. Goodbye, sweethearts. I'm going to miss my precious little girls. Watch out for the boys, you can't trust them. I helped Aaron up the stairs, before hissing at the grinning middle-aged woman sitting behind the driving wheel. Close the doors, if you have any sense of mercy, close the doors and dive away. I heard her explain, you got to be seated before I can get up, moving young lady, as my dad continued to shout outside. I put some money in your lunch bag to buy milk. You're still growing, you're going to need it for strong bones. Oh, and tell all your friends I opening a dojo, I'm going to need students. I threw myself into a seat next to my brother and the bus jerked into motion. Wait. What? So that's how my morning started on the first day of school. As the bus rattled down the road, I looked over my shoulder to see both my parents waving at me, Ami and Aaron, with my dad blowing kisses at us with both hands. My brother was waving back, while Ami had slunk down in her seat behind me. Slunk was how my grandfather described me moving around in the morning before anyone else woke up. To come or go unobtrusively or furtively. Sitting down, I glanced at the reflection in the window over Aaron's head to check who was slipping up the aisle behind me. The younger black kid was focused on keeping an eye on the driver while he slunk up the aisle half bent over in an effort not to be seen being out of his seat in the moving bus. He was so distracted in doing so, he didn't even notice as I twisted around in my seat to look him dead in the eye as he dropped down in the seat opposite my younger sister. For a moment, he looked surprised as I asked him, "Something I can help you with?" Then he got a big grin on his face. "Yeah, I heard your dad is opening a dojo. Is he going to teach the wolves how to fight, or can he teach me how to fight them?" Another kid with a big, tangled mess of red hair yelled out from the back. "Shut up, Kevin." Two of the other people on the bus yelled out as well, quite happily. "Shut up, Kevin." Kevin, I presumed, rolled his eyes, then stuck out a hand. "Hi, I'm Kevin." I rolled my eyes a bit. "Yeah, I heard." "Sarah." I shook his hand. He grinned and held his hand out to my sister. She looked away for a moment, straightened up, and turned back to shake his hand. "Ami Kane." And today is the first time either me or my sister have heard anything about our dad opening a dojo. But you should be careful about signing up to train with him. Still clutching to his hand, she leaned forward to whisper at him. "Our uncle says he practices a dodge-a-wrench school of teaching." Then she nodded slowly, before letting go of his hand. Kevin looked confused for a moment, then a little worried. The red-headed kid laughed, while a black girl around my age leaned across the aisle from further back at him to whisper, "What did she say?" The bus driver laughed and I looked up to see Grandpa standing in front of his gate. The old man had changed into a bathrobe, bunny slippers, and was wearing a knight's helmet as he waved at the bus as it drove by his house. Ami giggled as Kevin stood up and slowly turned to keep Grandpa in sight, before sitting down and looking from me to my sister. "That was your grandfather, right?" I sat back and took my hands from my face. "No. Don't ask again." The old bus rattled to a stop a moment later and a 9-year-old girl rushed in the door, with her mom in her deputy's uniform sitting on the hood of a sheriff's department vehicle and giving her daughter a last wave as the bus began to pull away. "Oh sure, the little werewolf girl can run around with the bus in motion." Werewolf shenanigans, calling it. I had heard of shenanigans before, but had still looked them up to get the official definition. Secret or dishonest activity, or maneuvering. Melinda stopped in the aisle next to me and began pushing past my legs. "Hi Sarah, I want to sit next to Aaron. We're in different grades, and I want to play with him while I can." She wiggled in between me and my brother, then blew in his ear to get his attention from the window, making the boy jump in his seat before running his ear into his shoulder while giving her a bewildered look. The little girl nodded at him. "Your mom told me to do that when you went off in your head, she said it works on your dad too." I abandoned my seat. My brother was in good if slightly unwanted hands. He gave me a pleading look as I wandered down the aisle of the bus towards an increasingly worried-looking girl who I guessed was the older sister of Kevin. Yes, I did guess that because she was black as well, but I was heading her way because she was the only girl on the bus my age. "Hi, I'm Sarah, and I am lacking in most social skills. Can I sit next to you?" She blinked rapidly, then gave me a shy smile as she nodded and slid over to give me some room. I noticed she was hanging on to a school bag in her lap almost protectively, but not from me. In fact, she relaxed a little as I sat. "So I'm Sarah, and my family just moved to town and I'm hoping you can fill me in on some things?" Her eyes went wide and she shook her head. "SSA sorry. We just moved here too." My whole family. She paused. Oh, I'm Nicole Weber, Nicole Weber. Then she nodded, more to herself than me. I leaned over and whispered. So wolves? Her face went red. We aren't supposed to talk about that, unless. She gave me a questing look. Looking up at the window again, I could see the red-headed kid carefully not looking our way as he stared intently at the back of the seat in front of him with an intent look. I held up one finger to Nicole to wait, then turned around to face the boy across the way. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the key ring with all of 2 keys on it in addition to the silver-plated whistle on it. It had been one of the first things I had ordered with the gift certificate my aunt had gotten me. Holding up the whistle, I asked. Do you know what this is? The boy's eyes glanced at me, but he didn't turn his head. I shook my keys. Oddly enough, it's called the Redhead Silent Dog Whistle. I don't know if it will hurt your ears, but I'm willing to find out if you keep listening in on a private conversation. Now he turned his head, wide-eyed as he looked at the whistle, more in curiosity than fear. Is that really a dog whistle? Does that even work on us? I looked down at it. I'm not sure. I haven't wanted to try it around my dog if it's going to hurt her ears, and he kept following me every time I tried to sneak off to try it myself. I tucked it back in my pants pocket, one of the ones my mom special ordered, which had real pockets and an extra piece of fabric in the middle so I could do kicks without splitting the seam. I mostly got it to taunt my grandpa, but its moment hasn't come yet. Turning the other way, I saw Nicole giving me a horrified look. What? She leaned forward to look at the red-headed kid, then scrunched down in her seat. Isn't that dangerous? I frowned a little. He's like 9. I pointed across the aisle. My sister could take him, and she hardly trains anymore. Not at fighting. The red-headed kid let out a hey. In protest. I rolled my eyes at him. Seriously, my dad taught her to go for the eyes and the fingers. She wouldn't fight you, just hurt you badly enough so you can't fight. Plus she's mean. The red-headed kid started to look thoughtful as Ami turned to look down the aisle and pointed her finger at her eyes, then at him. Then I turned back to Nicole. So my family moved here to live closer to family after our old house burned down without anyone getting hurt. You? We managed to have a nice chat for the rest of the trip. Nicole, who had been listening in fascinated horror, shook herself. Ah, right. My dad had a chance to retire early, and my parents wanted to settle down somewhere quiet. My mom's a doctor, and this is one of the places she applied for that made her a decent offer. She shrugged. We only got into town a few days ago and our stuff is still catching up with us. We live just down the road and around the bend from you, which I think puts us closer to town than you. I talked about the house my parents had built with the insurance money for our old house, while Nicole talked about the big old house her family had bought with a plan to work on it while they were already living there. My dad really wants to get forced air in before winter, but we're probably going to get stuck with the steam pipes. I kind of like them though, you can heat things on them. Nicole's family had lived all over the world, following her mom's career in the military, and then her dad's work in the embassy service. Which I would have loved to hear some more details about, but then we arrived at Marikern High. My new school was old and looked its age. It was mostly red brick with weather-stained decorative cement molding, but it did have newer energy-efficient windows set in plastic-covered walls to fill in the old wider windows from the days when natural light and air circulation were more of an issue. Not that I was going to need to jump out of a window, it was just the training I had gotten from my mom since I was old enough to walk to figure out escape routes from any building I ever headed into. Got to go, Nicole, I want to walk my little brother and sister over to the elementary school. I gave her a wave and heard her give me a cheerful "see you" as I tapped Melinda on the head before she managed to sneak off with my brother by the hand. No kidnapping my brother, Melinda. You can walk over with him, but Ami will drop him off at kindergarten. She gave me a hurt look, but couldn't hold it as she smiled. Outside the bus, she and Ami took each of my brother's hands and headed off to a one-story twin building to the high school. Marikern Elementary. Kevin, his red-headed friend, and some other kids headed off as well. The redhead turned to look at me along with Kevin, who jerked his thumb at his friend. "He skipped by the way, and he was delighted to be threatened by you. See ya." Kevin took off running with his friend, who after giving a quick head shake, began running after him. "Shut up, Kevin." Some other children repeated the shout. Kevin seemed to have established himself pretty well for only being in town for a few days. According to the email my parents had CC'd to me, I had homeroom with Ms. Claire first, which was weird since homeroom seemed like something out of a manga, but Grandpa and his brothers had confirmed that it was something their schools had done when they were young. Heading up the stairs, I made it up to the 3rd floor, and from there it was easy to find room 302, which to my surprise had an assortment of students who looked all the way up to senior age. By the fact I had at least seen if not met all of them from the solstice party, I could guess that this was all the werewolves in the school. At least the students. I could see Dell and 2 of the girls who had hung around her most of the party chatting, and Neil sitting in the back of the room looking half asleep. Anita looked up and frowned. "What's she doing here?" Dell looked over at me and gave me a wave with a grin. Tilting her head at Neil, she called across the room, "There's no point sitting with him, he won't wake up until lunch. Come sit with us." Both of Dell's friends looked surprised while I headed over, with some heads turning to watch me as I walked across the room, causing Dell to sigh and stand up. Could everyone go ahead and openly stare at her and get over it? She started counting off on her fingers. "Yes, she's rich. She's not a werewolf, but she is stronger than me, so don't start anything with her, because you all know I'm stronger than any of you. I don't have a problem with her, or her family, so none of you should either." Freezing in place, halfway across the room, I slowly turned my head to see several people looking embarrassed, or deliberately indifferent. 2 people gave me steady stares. One, a red-headed girl who looked 17, was leaning forward with an evil smirk as she tapped her fingers on each hand together and did an evil laugh, before straightening up and grinning. "That's a cane, go get in good with the mean girls, they needed a 4th anyways." Dell glared at the redhead. "We're not the mean girls, we're just popular." The other one who opening looked at me was a heavy-set boy who looked like he was still recovering his weight from a growth spurt. The look he gave me was almost hostile, like he was measuring me up before a fight. I tried to slunk the rest of the way across the room, then slipped into a seat behind Anita across from Delaware. "So what's with all of us in the same homeroom?" The bell rang before Dell could answer, and a 30-something blonde woman with a pageboy haircut slipped into the door. "Good morning, class. Welcome to Werewolf 101. My new teacher dropped an oversized purse-like bag on the desk at the front of the class and turned around to write her name on the old-fashioned green-colored blackboard behind her. "For those of you who are new, I'm Ms. Claire. And most of what I'm going to go over today your parents or older siblings should have filled you in on already." She pointed the stick of chalk still in her hand at me. "But, we got someone new in town, so most of this should be new for her, even if it doesn't apply to her, and it never hurts to go over this again for the rest of you." Turning around, she drew a hashtag on the blackboard, then a number 1 followed by the words she spoke out loud at the same time. Number 1. No turning into a wolf. She turned to look at the class, some of whom had spoken along with her. With her chalk in hand, she continued. No showing off your strength, or your speed, or your wolf senses. She singled me out again. Or any other supernatural powers. Her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms. I know just about everyone in this town is either related to one of us, or is otherwise in the know about us. But high school is where you are old enough to practice keeping secrets while learning with, working with, and even dating regular people. She got a few giggles from that. Then she wrote rule number 2. No fighting. All of you are too strong to fight a regular human, you might kill them and would definitely hurt them. If want to prove something, grow up. You already know you can beat them. She singled out the guy who had been glaring at me. And if you have something to prove against another werewolf, then both of you go see the sheriff so can referee. The boy Otten grunted, then pointed at me. What about her? Miss Claire looked down her nose at him. You want to fight a girl? He blushed and glared. No. I want to fight someone who knows how to fight. I don't care if she beats me, Dolores already did that. I want to see how she would do it different. Oh. First of all, I turned to look at Dell and mouthed the name Dolores. She rolled her eyes and nodded. Then I looked over at Ms. Claire and raised my hand. She pointed her chalk me with a warning look. This isn't the time to set up a date with Austin, Sarah. I felt my face heat up. No, I just wanted to tell him my dad is starting a dojo. He's strong enough to train werewolves, and I think he's been experimenting on my grandpa to develop a martial art specifically for werewolves. I looked over at Austin to see him and most of the other boys in the class, as well as some of the girls, giving me interested looks. I should warn you though, he likes fighting, and since you guys heal fast, really fast, I shrugged. It might be as much learning how to fight you, as teaching you how to fight. A few of them, the smarter one I guessed, looked thoughtful. Others, especially Austin, looked eager, and they started asking questions before Ms. Claire tapped her fingernail on the blackboard, instantly getting everyone's attention. Why? On your own time, boy and girls, we only have a few more minutes, and 2 last things to cover. Rule 4 was no biting. If they aren't wolves by the age of 12, a bite is just going to mean a trip to the hospital. Rule 5 was no sports. You can play games after school in the old gym with each other, but playing sports with regulars is both unfair and might get them hurt. I hesitantly raised my hand again, getting a slightly irritated if amused look from Ms. Claire. Yes, Sarah. Lowering my hand and looking down at the floor, I almost whispered my question. Like it mattered in a room filled with werewolves. What about the other Olympics? Before anyone could ask, the bell rang again, causing most of the class, including the teacher, to flinch at the loud noise. As the question started, Ms. Claire tapped her fingernail on the board again, and when that didn't work, she winced and began dragging her fingernails across the board with a screeching sound that made all the students in the class, including me, wince in pain. You only have 5 minutes to get your next class puppies. Kane, Ash, and Roger stay, the rest of you, out. A few people shot me some frustrated look as they shuffled out, and for a moment I wondered if I was in trouble before I remembered I had Ms. Claire for literature in the same room. Dell patted me on the shoulder as she headed out and wished me good luck, as she headed out while pointing over my shoulder. Turning around, I saw Neil and Austin standing off against each other, the larger boy Austin glaring down at a confused-looking Neil. Back off, Evans, I want to talk to her. Neil blinked at him. I just wanted to say hi to her before I go to my next class. You won't have time to ask her about that stuff anyways. I leaned back in my chair and waved at Neil. Hi Neil, I'll wake you up and say hi tomorrow. He grinned and waved at me. Hi Sarah, bye Austin. Then he headed for the down, stopped, and patted both of his shoulders with a confused look, before turning to pick up his book bag from beside his seat and heading back out the classroom door, all the while avoiding eye contact with me. Cute. Then I had an oversized teenager blocking my view. I sighed as I looked up at the surly boy trying his best to look friendly. Olympics? The other remaining person in the class, an awkward-looking boy with oversized eyes, leaned forward in his desk to look past Austin as he listened in. It's not really an Olympics type thing. It's just the families started having fighting matches to show off, and some people started playing volleyball in a gym next door. Pretty soon it got organized with other sports, and then some people started getting together for things like archery and even swimming. A few other students started showing up in the class, so I leaned forward to whisper past Auden to the other boy. There might even be werewolves playing in them already. As long as they stay in human form I wouldn't know, and anyone who would never said anything to me. Both of them started asking questions, only to stop as Ms. Claire tapped her fingernail on the blackboard again. This is my time, gentlemen. Mouth shut, books out. Then she winked at me. I'm going to want a 500-word report on these games by Wednesday, Sarah. Feel free to have your parents help you. You'll get extra credit, maybe from more than just my class. I sighed. Great, my first class hasn't even started and I have homework already.